I am Meredith, 33 years old, and a wealth management consultant who just watched my own family literally throw away a fortune. At our annual Christmas dinner, my 82-year-old grandmother handed each of us a red envelope containing a check for $5 million. My family erupted into cruel laughter, tearing the paper to shreds and mocking her declining mind. I quietly slipped my check into my pocket. The very next morning at the bank, the manager scanned my check, locked his office door, and pulled the blinds shut. He looked at me with pure terror and told me this was not a bank draft, but a trigger code for something much bigger. Before I continue the story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member who constantly underestimated your worth. The dining room inside my parents' sprawling Connecticut estate was suffocatingly warm, filled with the scent of roasted duck and the overwhelming arrogance of people who believed their own lies. We were seated around the massive mahogany table, crystal glasses gleaming under the chandelier. Grandma Beatrice sat at the far end. She had been living with my parents for the last 3 years, largely ignored and treated like a nuisance who had overstayed her welcome. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached into her woven cardigan and pulled out 4 thick red envelopes, sliding them across the polished wood toward each of us. My sister Sydney, the undisputed 30-year-old golden child of the family, picked up the envelope with perfectly manicured fingers. She broke the seal, pulled out the crisp piece of paper, and scoffed loudly. She held it up by the corner as if it were contaminated. It was a check made out to her for exactly $5 million. Sydney rolled her eyes, let out a dramatic sigh, and immediately ripped the check squarely in half, letting the pieces flutter onto her dinner plate. Beside her sat her husband, Trey. At 32, Trey was a smooth-talking venture capitalist who wore custom-tailored suits and commanded every room he entered. As an African-American man who had effortlessly charmed his way into my father's elite insular country club circle, Trey loved nothing more than flaunting his perceived success. He opened his envelope, saw the amount, and threw his head back in a booming theatrical laugh. He crumpled the check in his fist and dropped it directly into his glass of expensive whiskey, watching the ink bleed into the amber liquid. "Granny is getting creative with her dementia," Trey announced to the table, shaking his head with a condescending smirk. "I deal with $50 million seed rounds before my morning coffee. I do not have time for monopoly money." I looked down at the envelope resting in front of me. As a wealth management consultant, I spend my days analyzing financial documents, tracing assets, and verifying corporate funds. The paper stock of the check protruding from the red flap caught my eye. It possessed the distinct heavy weight and specific microprinting of a certified bank draft. I reached my hand out to pick it up. Before my fingers could even graze the paper, my father Gregory slammed his hand down hard over my wrist, swatting me away. "Do not embarrass us, Meredith." He snapped, his voice sharp and laced with the familiar disgust he reserved only for me. "You are always begging for scraps. Leave the garbage on the table." I pulled my hand back, the sting radiating up my forearm, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the anger boiling in my chest. "Begging for scraps," I repeated, keeping my voice dangerously level. "I asked you to co-sign a $5,000 student loan 10 years ago so I could finish my finance degree. You looked me in the eye and told me to figure it out myself because my career choice was a joke. Yet you wrote Trey a $2 million blank check to fund his venture capital startup just last year without a single piece of collateral." My mother Carolyn slammed her wine glass down, the liquid sloshing over the rim. "Do not you dare raise your voice to your father in this house," she hissed, her diamond necklace catching the light as she glared at me. "Trey is a visionary. Your sister married a winner who actually knows how to multiply wealth. You manage other people's money for a mediocre salary while living in a cramped apartment. Do not project your pathetic jealousy onto your sister's successful marriage." I looked over at Grandma Beatrice. She simply sat there, a vacant, confused smile plastered on her wrinkled face as my family degraded her holiday gift. But for a fraction of a second, I caught a sharp, piercing glint in her eyes. It was not the look of a senile old woman losing her grip on reality. It was the look of someone observing mice walk blindly into a trap. Ignoring my father's furious glare, I reached out again, snatched my red envelope from the table, and slid it safely into the inside pocket of my blazer. Sydney laughed her high, mocking laugh, leaning into Trey's shoulder. Look at the wealth manager scraping up fake money from a crazy old lady. Maybe you can use it to buy a dress that was not on the clearance rack, Meredith. I did not respond. I finished my dinner in total silence, letting them bask in their cruelty, completely unaware of the storm that was brewing. The next morning, the winter air was freezing as I walked through the heavy glass doors of the Chase Bank downtown. I marched straight to the desk of Mr. Jenkins, the senior branch manager who handled high net worth verifications. I pulled the check from my blazer and placed it on his desk. I told him I needed to verify the routing and account numbers, fully prepared for him to tell me it was a forgery drawn up by a confused elderly woman. Mr. Jenkins adjusted his glasses and typed the string of numbers into his secure terminal. I watched his screen. A sudden bright red notification flashed across his monitor. The color instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking as though he had just seen a ghost. Without saying a word, he stood up. Abruptly, walked over to his glass office door, flipped the deadbolt lock, and pulled the privacy blinds down tight. He turned back to me, his hands physically shaking as he leaned across his desk. Ma'am, we need to talk. This is not just a check, it is a trigger code. Jenkins pulled out a heavy leather-bound ledger from his locked filing cabinet. His voice was a hushed whisper, completely devoid of the usual corporate polish he displayed in the bank lobby. Your grandmother is not the frail, confused woman your family treats her as, Ms. Harrington. She is the sole grantor and beneficiary of a massive blind trust established over 40 years ago. The assets are tied to prime commercial real estate across the entire eastern seaboard. We are talking about liquid and fixed assets totaling over $80 million. I sat frozen in the leather guest chair, my breath catching in my throat. $80 million. My parents had treated Beatrice like an absolute burden for years, constantly complaining to anyone who would listen about her grocery bills and her medical co-pays. Gregory had even threatened to put her in a state-funded nursing facility just last month, claiming she was a financial drain on his lifestyle. Jenkins slid a single, pristine sheet of paper across the desk. Those checks were not a holiday gift, Meredith. They were a highly calculated behavioral test. The trust carries an ironclad no-contest clause specifically designed to weed out greedy, ungrateful beneficiaries. The moment your sister and your brother-in-law tore up those checks, they triggered an automatic and irreversible disinheritance protocol. The checks were encoded with a digital watermark. By rejecting the initial $5 million distribution with malicious intent, they legally forfeited any right to the greater estate. My mind raced to process the information. As a wealth management consultant, I had seen complex estate planning and ruthless corporate maneuvering, but nothing this brilliantly deceptive. Beatrice had sat at that dining table playing the role of a senile old woman, watching her own bloodline fail a character test she had masterfully engineered. You are the only one who kept the check. Jenkins continued, his eyes darting nervously toward the locked office door. You are now the sole legal heir to the entire $80 million trust. I just need your signature to initiate the transfer of control. Before I could even reach for the pen, a violent pounding rattled the frosted glass of the office door. The heavy, aggressive thuds echoed loudly through the quiet bank lobby. I turned around and saw the towering frame of Trey looming on the other side of the glass. He was wearing his signature tailored charcoal suit, his face contorted in absolute rage. Open this door right now, Jenkins! Trey shouted, his deep voice easily carrying through the thick glass partition. My heart slammed against my ribs. How did he possibly know I was here? Jenkins looked at his computer monitor in pure panic, his hands hovering over the keyboard. He is the primary administrator on your parents' joint accounts. Since the check was drawn from a routing number tied to the Harrington family matrix, any scan would trigger an immediate fraud alert to the master account holder. He got a ping on his phone the exact second I ran your check through the verification scanner. Trey pounded on the glass again, harder this time, causing the metal frame of the door to shudder violently. I know you are in there, Meredith. Open the door before I call bank security and have you dragged out in handcuffs. I stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from my pencil skirt. I deal with aggressive corporate egos every single day of my life. I was not going to cower in a bank office, especially not to a man who had leeched off my family for years. I stepped past Jenkins, reached for the handle, and unlocked the door. Trey shoved the door open so hard it slammed into the wall behind it. He stormed into the room, his expensive cologne filling the small space, and immediately directed his towering anger at the bank manager. "Are you completely out of your mind?" Jenkins Trey demanded, leaning over the desk and planting his hands firmly on the polished wood. "You are attempting to process a high-yield bearer instrument from an account flagged for senior cognitive decline. That violates all anti-money laundering regulations and every single fiduciary standard in the corporate handbook. I will have your financial license revoked by noon and your entire branch audited by Friday morning." Jenkins shrank back into his chair, visibly overwhelmed by the rapid-fire venture capital jargon. Trey was a master at using aggressive financial terminology to bulldoze anyone in his path. It was the exact same tactic he had used to squeeze a $2 million investment out of my father for his tech startup, while I was forced to work 3 jobs just to pay my own rent. Trey then turned his glaring eyes to me, looking me up and down with utter contempt. "And you. I knew you were desperate, Meredith, but this is a new low even for the family disappointment. Stealing a fake check from a woman who does not even know what year it is. You really thought you could walk in here and cash a $5 million piece of scrap paper? You are a glorified accountant. You do not have the clearance or the pedigree to handle this kind of capital." I crossed my arms, refusing to break eye contact with him. "It is not fake, Trey. And if you had bothered to treat Beatrice with a single ounce of respect last night, you would know that. The money is entirely real, and because you and Sydney treated it like garbage, it is all mine now." Trey let out a booming, patronizing laugh that mirrored his cruel behavior at the Christmas dinner. He straightened his silk tie and reached into his sleek leather briefcase. "You think you are so smart?" he said, pulling out a thick notarized document and slapping it down heavily right over my grandmother's check. "You think I would leave a massive financial loophole like this open? I run $50 million funds. I protect my investments against liabilities like you." I looked down at the document on the desk. The bold header read, "Durable Power of Attorney and Medical Proxy." My stomach dropped to the floor. "My sister-in-law has a well-documented history of severe mental instability." Trey announced, his voice dripping with venom as he spoke directly to Jenkins. "5 years ago, when she suffered her little depressive breakdown, her father granted me full legal conservatorship and power of attorney over her financial decisions. She is not legally competent to authorize any transfers whatsoever." "That was 5 years ago," I fired back, my voice rising in defense. "I was grieving a bad breakup and dealing with burnout. I was not institutionalized. That document is expired and you know it." Trey smiled, a cold, calculated grin that showed perfectly white teeth. "It is active until a judge says otherwise in a court of law." He turned back to the bank manager, his tone dropping to a lethal, commanding whisper. "You are going to take that check, Jenkins. You are going to bypass the holding period, and you are going to wire those funds directly into my venture capital operating account right now. If you do not, I will walk straight to the police station across the street. I will have my sister-in-law arrested for elder financial abuse, and I will name you as her primary co-conspirator." I did not flinch. While Jenkins trembled in his leather chair, terrified of the aggressive venture capitalist standing over him, I simply reached out and pulled the thick, notarized document from beneath Trey's manicured hands. "I deal with fraudulent claims, shell companies, and desperate executives every single day of my professional life." My eyes scanned the heavy cardstock, bypassing the intimidating legal jargon and zeroing in on the metadata block printed at the very bottom margin. Trey relied on his imposing presence and aggressive intimidation to blind people to the fine print. But I am a wealth management consultant. I live in the fine print. I ran my finger over the electronic signature validation code. I looked up at him and let out a sharp, genuine laugh. "You are sloppy, Trey." His smug expression faltered for a fraction of a second. "What are you talking about?" I slid the document back across the mahogany desk, tapping my fingernail against the bottom left corner. "You drafted this power of attorney using an electronic signature platform. The validation timestamp right here shows it was executed on October 14th, exactly 5 years ago. I leaned forward, lowering my voice to a lethal, unwavering register. But the IP address, logged in the digital certificate, traces back to a server protocol that did not exist until a software update 3 years ago. You did not get my signature 5 years ago, when I was vulnerable. You backdated this document last night using cheap spoofing software. Trey's jaw tightened. The veins in his neck pulsed against his crisp silk collar. If you try to process a forged power of attorney to siphon $80 million from a blind trust, I will not just call the police. I continued, my voice steady and cold. I will call the Securities and Exchange Commission. I will report you for wire fraud, identity theft, and federal banking violations. I will trigger an immediate freeze on every single one of your seed rounds. Your investors will flee before the ink dries on your arrest warrant. Do you really want to play financial roulette with me? Trey stood perfectly still. The arrogant bravado melted away, replaced by the cornered look of a man who realized he had brought a knife to a gunfight. He snatched the forged document off the desk, shoved it into his leather briefcase, and took a step back toward the glass door. You are going to regret this, he snapped, his voice tight with barely suppressed rage. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket, his thumbs flying across the screen. You just started a war you do not have the capital to finish. He pushed the office door open and stormed into the main bank lobby. Through the glass partition, I watched him put the phone to his ear, pacing furiously near the teller line. Jenkins let out a massive breath, pulling a handkerchief from his pocket to wipe the sweat from his forehead. Ms. Harrington. Jenkins stammered, his voice shaking. I cannot process this transfer under these conditions. The liability is astronomical. We need legal counsel. Before I could assure Jenkins that I would handle the legalities, the heavy double doors at the front of the bank flew open. The freezing winter wind rushed into the lobby, carrying with it the deafening sound of my mother's voice. Where is she? Carolyn screamed, her designer fur coat flapping around her ankles as she marched past the security guard. Gregory was right behind her, his face flushed red with fury. Trey had called in the reinforcements. My parents did not care about banking decorum. They operated on the belief that whoever yelled the loudest controlled the narrative. Carolyn spotted me through the glass walls of Jenkins's office and charged forward. She threw the door open, ignoring the bank manager entirely. You ungrateful, malicious little thief, Carolyn shouted, pointing a shaking finger at my face. Every customer and teller in the lobby stopped dead, turning their attention to the spectacle. You are stealing from a senile old woman. My mother is 82 years old. Her mind is gone. And you dragged her to a bank to manipulate her into signing over her life savings. I stood up, keeping my posture rigid. I did not bring Beatrice here, Mother. She handed me a check last night at your dinner table. The same check you allowed your golden child and her husband to treat like garbage. Gregory stepped into the office, his imposing frame blocking the doorway. He pointed directly at Jenkins. I am Gregory Harrington. I sit on the board of 3 regional development firms. If you process a single dime for this woman, I will personally see to it that you are fired by the end of the day. My daughter is mentally unstable and is actively attempting to defraud a vulnerable senior citizen. Cancel the transaction immediately. It is not a transaction, Gregory fired back, refusing to call him Dad. It is a legally binding trust trigger, and your precious son-in-law just tried to steal it with a forged document. Carolyn gasped, placing a dramatic hand over her chest as she stepped back into the public lobby, ensuring her voice echoed off the vaulted ceilings. She played the role of the devastated, concerned mother with terrifying perfection. Listen to her, Carolyn cried out to the watching crowd. She is delusional. She has always been a pathological liar trying to tear our family apart out of pure, bitter jealousy. We gave you everything, Meredith. We gave you a home, an education, a prestigious name. And this is how you repay us. By trying to rob my sick mother blind. I walked out of the office, stepping into the lobby to face her head-on. You gave me nothing, I stated loudly, making sure every single person in that bank heard the truth. You refused to pay my college tuition. You forced me to take out predatory loans while you handed Sydney a down payment for her penthouse. You invited me to Christmas dinner just so you could mock my career. You do not care about Beatrice. You only care that she gave her money to the daughter you despise." Gregory's face twisted into an ugly sneer. He took a threatening step toward me, towering over my frame. "You listen to me, you worthless little rat. You are going to sign a relinquishment form right now, or I will destroy your career. I will call your firm. I will tell them you are under federal investigation for elder abuse. You will never work in wealth management again." I held my ground, my chin raised. "Call them. My firm knows my track record. Yours knows you fund Ponzi schemes." Carolyn lost whatever shred of composure she had left. Her face went pale, then violently red. She marched right up to my face, her voice rising to a hysterical screech that silenced the entire building. "This is exactly why we should have left you at that group home," she screamed, the words ripping out of her throat like jagged glass. "You have bad blood. You always had bad blood. We should have never brought you into this family." The bank lobby went dead silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the heating vent above us. I stood completely paralyzed. The breath was knocked out of my lungs as her words echoed in my ears. I stared at the woman who had raised me, the woman who had criticized my hair, my grades, and my career for 33 years. Group home. What was she talking about? I opened my mouth to speak, but my voice failed me entirely. I looked at Gregory. He was glaring at Carolyn, his jaw clenched in sudden, furious panic. He grabbed her arm, realizing she had just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. But the damage was done. The ground beneath my feet felt like it had completely vanished. I practically sprinted to my car after the bank disaster, my mother's hysterical voice still echoing off the concrete walls of the lobby. Group home. Bad blood. I shoved those jagged words down into a mental lockbox. I did not have time to dissect my own childhood right now. I had a job to do. I drove straight to my corporate office at Vanguard Wealth Management, desperate to reach the one place where logic and numbers reigned supreme. I planned to march straight into our legal department and secure an attorney to fight my family. But the moment I stepped off the elevator and onto the trading floor, an icy wall of silence hit me. Usually, the 71st floor buzzed with morning energy analysts shouting over phones and financial anchors blaring from the mounted televisions. Today, 40 of my colleagues stopped typing. They all turned and stared at me with wide, uncomfortable eyes. My boss, Richard, stood at the glass door of his corner office. A woman from Human Resources stood right behind him holding a thick manila folder. Meredith, Richard said, his tone entirely stripped of its usual warmth. "Inside, right now." I walked past the rows of staring faces, my heels clicking loudly on the hardwood floor. I stepped into his office, and Richard closed the blinds, plunging the room into shadows. He did not ask me to sit. Instead, he reached over to his desk, grabbed his tablet, and spun the screen around to face me. "You need to explain this immediately," he demanded. On the screen, a video was looping. It was a TikTok. My sister Sydney filled the frame wearing an oversized, frumpy sweater to look small and vulnerable. She was sitting in what looked like a hospital waiting room, crying perfectly calculated heavy tears. Her mascara was running down her cheeks. "Hi guys," Sydney sobbed to the camera, her voice shaking with manufactured terror. "I never thought I would have to make a video like this. But my older sister Meredith is a wealth manager at Vanguard. She just tried to steal my 82-year-old grandmother's life savings. My grandma has severe dementia. Meredith locked her in a room, isolated her from our family, and tried to siphon $5 million this morning. Please, if you bank with Vanguard, check your accounts. I am so scared for my family." I stared at the screen in absolute horror. The video already had 4 million views. The caption read, "Protect our elders from corporate predators," complete with hashtags naming my firm and my specific office branch. Richard slammed his hand on the desk. "Our switchboards have been lighting up since 7 o'clock this morning. We have clients threatening to pull 9-figure portfolios. A wealth management firm cannot employ a consultant actively accused of elder financial abuse by her own flesh and blood. You are a liability, Meredith. The PR team is having a heart attack." "That video is a complete fabrication," I fired back, my voice steady, despite the adrenaline flooding my veins. "My grandmother gave me a check last night. Sydney tore hers up because she thought it was a joke. Now they are trying to cover their tracks by destroying my reputation. The human resources representative crossed her arms, looking at me with thinly veiled disgust. Your sister provided an active power of attorney document to the press, proving she and her husband are the legal guardians. She looks genuinely traumatized, Meredith. Why would your own sister lie on a global platform? I leaned over Richard's desk, placing both my hands flat on the glass surface. I looked straight into the eyes of the HR representative. Because playing the victim is Sydney's full-time job, I stated, enunciating every single word. I asked them if a woman crying on command for social media clout was really the ultimate authority on truth. I told them exactly who my sister was. I asked Richard if he wanted to know about the time Sydney stole my Honda Civic on the night of her senior prom. She drove drunk, wrapped the car around a telephone pole, and fled the scene. She crawled into my bed, sobbing, covered in glass and smelling of vodka, begging me to save her. My parents found the wreck. They dragged me out of bed, drove me to the police station, and forced me to take the criminal charge. They told me I had to take the fall because Sydney had an Ivy League scholarship, and I was just going to a state school anyway. I took the blame. I took the probation. That is the girl crying on your screen. She destroys things and points the finger at me. Richard looked away, his jaw tight. He let out a heavy sigh, rubbing his temples. I believe you, Meredith. You are the sharpest consultant on this floor. But belief does not pay our shareholders. Cancel culture does not care about the truth. It cares about optics. Effective immediately, you are suspended without pay, pending a full internal and legal investigation. Hand over your corporate badge and your laptop. I did not argue. Arguing with a corporation protecting its bottom line was a waste of breath. I unclipped my security badge from my lapel, set it on the glass desk alongside my company phone and laptop, and walked out. I kept my head high as I marched back across the trading floor, refusing to give my staring coworkers the satisfaction of seeing me break. I took the elevator down to the underground parking garage and got into my car. The silence of the vehicle was deafening. My family had successfully stripped me of my inheritance, my job, and my public reputation in less than 24 hours. But I still had my private assets. I had been saving a massive emergency fund for years, building a pristine 820 credit score. I would simply liquidate my stock portfolio, hire the most ruthless corporate defense attorney in the state, and sue Trey and Sydney for defamation. I pulled out my personal cell phone and opened my secure financial banking application. I needed to check my global credit report to verify my liquid borrowing power for the attorney retainer. I logged in and waited for the dashboard to load. A bright red warning banner flashed across the top of my screen. Critical alert. Account delinquent. My brow furrowed. I tapped the alert, drilling down into my active credit lines. I expected to see my standard credit card and my modest auto loan. Instead, a wall of massive red numbers populated the screen. My heart completely stopped. There were 3 separate commercial mortgages listed under my Social Security number. Each mortgage was tied to a massive, depreciating commercial warehouse in an industrial sector I had never even visited. The total principal borrowed against my name was $12 million. All 3 loans were currently 90 days past due and marked as severely defaulted. My perfect credit score had plummeted to 410. I stared at the screen, my vision blurring as the horrific reality washed over me. I looked at the originating lender for the 3 defaulted mortgages. It was a subsidiary shell company managed by Trey's venture capital firm. My family had not just tried to steal my inheritance today, they had already stolen my identity years ago. They had secretly forged my signature to take out millions of dollars in toxic commercial debt, using my pristine credit to artificially fund Trey's failing business empire. I was completely bankrupt, massively in debt, and legally tied to a financial crime. I did not waste a single second staring at that glowing red screen. I threw my car into drive and sped out of the underground parking garage. The $12 million in fraudulent commercial debt was not just a crime. It was an act of financial terrorism committed by my own blood. I merged onto the highway, pointing my car straight toward the affluent suburbs of Connecticut. My parents thought they could destroy my career and steal my identity in the same morning to cover their own massive failures. They severely underestimated the woman they had spent 33 years pushing into the shadows. I bypassed the main entrance of my parents' sprawling estate, parking my car 2 blocks away on a quiet side street. I knew the security system blind spots perfectly from my teenage years of sneaking out. I slipped through the dense manicured hedges lining the perimeter of the backyard and crept silently toward the massive limestone patio. The smell of expensive cigar smoke and top-shelf bourbon drifted through the freezing winter air. I crouched behind a heavy stone planter and peered through the branches. Sitting around the outdoor fire pit were Gregory Trey and a third man I recognized instantly from my work in wealth management. His name was Arthur Vance, a ruthless probate attorney, notorious in elite circles for helping wealthy families quietly strip assets from elderly relatives. A thick stack of legal binders rested on the glass table between them. "We need the judge to sign the emergency order by tomorrow morning," Trey demanded, swirling the amber liquid in his crystal glass. "Meredith knows about the $80 million blind trust. She already tried to process the trigger check at the bank today. If she gets legal representation and formally accepts the beneficiary status, my venture capital firm is completely dead." Vance adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and tapped a gold pen against the legal pad. "The medical proxy you provided is solid, Trey, but securing a permanent conservatorship requires absolute proof of severe cognitive decline. We are petitioning the court to strip your grandmother of all human rights and financial autonomy. We are legally declaring her an incapacitated ward of the state, so Gregory can redirect the trust assets as her next of kin. Judges do not sign off on that overnight without overwhelming medical evidence." She gave her grandchildren blank checks for $5 million and smiled at the wall. Gregory snapped, leaning forward into the firelight. "The woman is entirely out of her mind. She has been living under my roof for 3 years, eating my food and taking up space. That $80 million commercial real estate portfolio belongs to me. I will not let my mediocre, ungrateful daughter snatch it away on a technicality." "Meredith is handled," Trey said with a cold, dismissive laugh. "I had her suspended from Vanguard this morning. Sydney posted a video accusing her of elder abuse that is currently destroying her entire professional reputation online. She has no job, no income, and absolutely no way to hire a litigator to fight us for the trust." Vance frowned, flipping through a separate file folder. "I am looking at the risk assessment for your venture capital firm, Trey. If Meredith somehow manages to pull her personal credit report, she is going to see the 3 commercial mortgages you defaulted on. Tying $12 million of toxic corporate debt to her Social Security number was incredibly reckless. If she takes that identity theft to federal regulators, this entire conservatorship strategy will collapse under an SEC fraud investigation." Trey took a long drag from his cigar and blew the smoke slowly into the cold air. "She is not going to federal regulators because she does not even know how to fight back. Forging her signature on those loan documents was the easiest capital I ever raised. Her Social Security number was still on file from when Gregory drained her childhood savings account a decade ago to cover his own margin calls. She is a useful idiot. She took the blame for Sydney crashing that car in high school, and she will take the fall for my defaulted mortgages now. She is collateral damage." My vision went entirely white. The sheer calculated malice of his words shattered whatever tiny fraction of familial loyalty I had left. I stepped out from behind the stone planter and marched directly onto the limestone patio. The 3 men froze. Gregory dropped his cigar. Vance scrambled to pull the legal binders against his chest. I slammed my printed credit report down onto the glass table with so much force the crystal glasses rattled. "You stole my identity to fund your failing business," I stated, my voice echoing loudly against the brick exterior of the mansion. "You forged my signature to take out $12 million in fraudulent commercial mortgages because you are a pathetic, incompetent fraud, Trey. You do not manage wealth, you steal it." Gregory shot out of his chair, his face contorted in rage. "How dare you trespass on my property? You have absolutely no right to be here." "I have every right," I fired back, stepping right up to my father. "You have been stealing from me since I was a child. You drained my savings. You ruined my credit. And now you are trying to imprison your own mother in a conservatorship to steal an $80 million trust that she specifically designed to keep out of your greedy hands. I am calling the SEC, the FBI, and every federal banking regulator in this state. I am taking Beatrice to the bank myself tomorrow morning, and I am finalizing that trust transfer. Trey did not panic. He did not yell or try to deny the forgery. He simply leaned back in his expensive patio chair and smiled. It was a cold, lifeless grin that chilled me to the bone. He casually reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out his smartphone. "You are trespassing on private property," Meredith Trey said smoothly, tapping the screen of his phone. "Say hi to the cops when they get here. I am sure they will love to hear how the disgraced wealth manager broke into her parents' home after trying to defraud her grandmother." I stood my ground. "Call them. We can show them the forged loan documents right now. Go get Beatrice. We will see exactly who is defrauding who." Trey locked eyes with me, his smile widening into something purely evil. "You are a little late for that, Meredith. Grandma is not here." My heart stalled. "What do you mean she is not here?" Gregory stepped forward, crossing his arms over his chest. "We had a medical transport team arrive at 7 o'clock this morning. Your grandmother was visibly distressed and legally incompetent. We moved her to a lockdown psychiatric ward in a private facility upstate. You have no legal proxy, you have no visitation rights, and you will never see her again." The wail of police sirens pierced the freezing Connecticut air before I could even process the absolute horror of my father's words. Trey had not been bluffing. He had already dialed the local precinct the moment I stepped onto the limestone patio. They were coming for me. I did not waste time screaming, crying, or bargaining with monsters who had just admitted to locking their own mother in a psychiatric ward for a paycheck. I turned on my heel and bolted. I scrambled through the dense, thorny hedges lining the perimeter of the estate. The sharp branches tore at my tailored blazer and scraped my hands, but the adrenaline completely drowned out the physical pain. I heard Gregory shouting my name from the patio, his heavy footsteps crunching on the gravel path behind me, but I was faster. I reached my car parked 2 blocks away on the dark suburban street, threw myself into the driver's seat, and slammed the accelerator to the floor. I drove erratically for 45 minutes, deliberately navigating the unlit, winding backroads to avoid the main highways and any potential police cruisers. I needed a secure location. I finally pulled into a rundown cash-only motel on the desolate outskirts of the county. The neon sign buzzed and flickered above the cracked asphalt. I paid the apathetic night clerk with a crisp $100 bill, grabbed the physical brass key to room number 12, and locked the flimsy door behind me. I threw the deadbolt, latched the security chain, and wedged the heavy wooden desk chair tightly under the door handle. My heart was pounding against my ribs, but my mind had never been sharper. Grief and panic were useless currencies right now. I opened my laptop, sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, and connected to a secure, encrypted offshore VPN. I am a wealth management consultant. My entire career is built on forensic accounting, tracing hidden assets, and identifying corporate fraud. If Trey thought he could hide a $12 million identity theft behind a few shell companies and intimidate me with police sirens, he severely underestimated the woman he was trying to destroy. I bypassed the standard search engines and dove straight into the state's commercial property registries, cross-referencing them with uniform commercial code filings. I pulled the corporate charters and operating agreements for the 3 specific LLCs that held the defaulted commercial mortgages in my name. The paper trail was deliberately convoluted, bouncing between registered agents in Delaware and offshore holding accounts in the Cayman Islands. It was designed to confuse an average auditor. But money always leaves a footprint. You just have to know how to follow the ink. I mapped the disbursement protocols line by line. The $12 million taken out under my forged signature was not sitting in a property escrow account. It had never been used to purchase commercial warehouses. The funds had been instantly wired into the primary operating account of Trey's venture capital firm. I did not stop there. I pulled up the public SEC disclosures, scoured the limited partner agreements, and began matching the capital inflows to the outbound wire transfers. The picture that emerged on my glowing screen was terrifying in its brazenness. Trey was not investing in emerging tech startups. He was not acquiring new intellectual property, he was running a massive textbook Ponzi scheme. The ledgers revealed a desperate, chaotic hemorrhage of cash. Every time a major seed round came due for his early investors, Trey used the fraudulent loans taken out in my name to pay them their expected returns. He was robbing Peter to pay Paul, keeping the brilliant illusion of a highly successful exclusive venture fund alive while the actual accounts were running on fumes. He was desperate for cash, which explained exactly why he needed to seize my grandmother's $80 million trust so aggressively. But the deeper I dug into the transaction histories, the more horrific the financial web became. I traced a series of massive, frantic wire transfers originating from a private wealth management account I recognized instantly. It was Gregory's primary retirement portfolio. My father, the man who had just threatened to destroy my career, the man who had willingly locked his own mother in a lockdown psychiatric ward to steal her trust fund, had already handed over his entire life savings to Trey. Millions of dollars completely liquidated and funneled directly into the Ponzi scheme to cover Trey's failing margins. Gregory was blindly financing the very scam that had stolen my identity. My parents worshipped the man who was actively bankrupting them while trying to destroy the daughter who actually knew how to read a balance sheet. I had them. I had the exact transaction IDs, the routing numbers, the forged digital signature dates, and the internal memos proving Trey was committing federal wire fraud. I plugged a high-capacity encrypted flash drive into my laptop and initiated a mass download of the entire digital ledger. The progress bar flashed on the screen, 20%, 40%. If I could just get these files to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the FBI, Trey would be looking at 20 years in a federal penitentiary. Gregory would lose every single ounce of the elite social standing he prized above his own family. And I could legally clear my name of the $12 million in fraudulent debt, 60%. The sound of heavy tires crunching on the gravel parking lot outside made my blood run cold. I glanced at the window. A black SUV had pulled up directly outside room number 12. 80%. Come on, I whispered to the screen, my finger hovering over the eject button. A heavy, suffocating shadow fell across the thin gap beneath the motel room door. Before I could even stand up, the cheap wooden door exploded inward. The deadbolt snapped like a twig, sending the heavy desk chair flying across the stained carpet and smashing into the wall. The freezing night air rushed into the room, followed immediately by Trey. He stepped over the splintered doorframe, his expensive cashmere overcoat standing out sharply against the dingy motel walls. Flanking him were two massive, heavily tattooed men who looked like they broke bones for a living. One of the men immediately lunged forward, slammed my laptop shut, and violently ripped the flash drive from the port. Trey adjusted his cuffs, brushing a splinter of wood from his lapel. That cold, empty smile returned to his face. He looked down at me, his voice eerily calm in the wreckage of the room. "You really should not go digging into my ledgers," Meredith Trey said softly, stepping closer. "My investors are very unforgiving people." I stared at the massive man who had just ripped the flash drive from my laptop. He handed the tiny silver rectangle to Trey. Trey held it up between his thumb and forefinger, his arrogant smile returning as he admired his prize. He thought he had won. He thought I was just a naive consultant playing out of my league. I slowly stood up from the sagging mattress. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I tapped the screen once and turned it around so Trey could see the display. "The flash drive was just a local backup, Trey," I said, keeping my voice dangerously steady. "What you are looking at on my screen is a scheduled encrypted email. It contains every single transaction ledger, wire transfer receipt, and margin call from your venture capital firm. The recipients are the Securities and Exchange Commission, the FBI Regional Field Office, and the three largest institutional investors in your fund." Trey's smile vanished. The color drained from his face as he stared at the glowing countdown timer on my phone screen. "I have it set on a dead man's switch." I continued, my thumb hovering inches above the screen. "It is programmed to send automatically in exactly 10 minutes. The only way to stop it is if I manually enter a secondary biometric passcode. If your gorillas touch me, if you try to take this phone, Or if my heart rate spikes and I drop it, that email goes out. Your entire Ponzi scheme becomes public federal record by midnight. The two massive men shifted nervously. They looked at Trey, waiting for an order. Trey clenched his jaw so tightly I could see a muscle jumping in his cheek. He knew I was not bluffing. He knew exactly what an SEC investigation would do to him. The investors he was defrauding were not the kind of people who filed lawsuits. They were the kind of people who made you disappear. Call them off, I demanded. Right now. Trey let out a slow, furious breath. He gave a sharp nod to the two men. They backed away, stepping toward the shattered doorframe. You think you are so smart, Meredith? Trey spat, his voice trembling with contained rage. You think this saves you? You have no job. Your reputation is completely destroyed. You are dead in this town. You cannot hide behind a scheduled email forever. I do not need forever, I replied. I just need you to get out of my room. Trey glared at me with absolute hatred. He turned and walked out into the freezing night, his two enforcers following closely behind. I waited until I heard the heavy doors of his SUV slam shut and the tires screech across the gravel. The moment they were gone, I entered my passcode and paused the email timer. My hands were shaking so violently I almost dropped the phone. I grabbed my laptop, shoved it into my leather bag, and sprinted out to my car. I could not stay here. Trey would regroup. He would figure out a way to jam the signal or track my location. I needed to move, and I needed to get to Beatrice. I drove 2 hours north, deep into the isolated wooded hills of upstate New York. The private psychiatric facility was surrounded by 12-foot-high wrought iron gates and dense pine trees. It looked less like a hospital and more like a high-security fortress for the ultra-wealthy to hide their embarrassing relatives. I parked my car in the visitor lot and took a deep breath. I had no legal authority to be here. Trey and Gregory held the medical proxy. But I knew the healthcare system. I knew corporate compliance, and I knew how terrified private medical facilities were of financial audits. I walked into the brightly lit, sterile lobby. The receptionist sat behind a thick sheet of plexiglass, typing lazily on her keyboard. I slapped my Vanguard Wealth Management corporate badge onto the counter. It was my secondary access card, the one Richard had forgotten to confiscate when he suspended me. Meredith Vance, Senior Compliance Auditor for Vanguard Wealth Management, I stated, using my sharpest, most intimidating corporate voice. I am here to conduct an unannounced financial welfare check on Beatrice Vance. The receptionist frowned and looked at my badge. You cannot see her. She was admitted this morning under a strict psychiatric hold by her legal conservators. No visitors allowed. I leaned close to the plexiglass, narrowing my eyes. I am not a visitor. I am a financial fiduciary, acting under federal mandate. Beatrice Vance's $80 million trust is currently under active audit. Under the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, specifically, the exemption for external financial auditing and insurance underwriting, I am legally required to verify the physical living conditions of the beneficiary before Vanguard approves the facility funding transfers. If you deny me access, I will flag this facility for Medicare fraud and freeze every single payment coming from her estate. The receptionist blanched. She picked up her desk phone and frantically dialed a supervisor. I could hear panicked whispering. A minute later, a stern-looking facility director marched out from a back office. She inspected my badge, looked at my completely unyielding expression, and sighed. You have 10 minutes, the director said. She is in the restricted wing. Do not upset her. She has severe dementia. A massive orderly escorted me down a long white corridor. Heavy steel doors clicked and buzzed open as we swiped through multiple security checkpoints. The air smelled strongly of bleach and institutional food. The orderly finally stopped in front of room 412. He unlocked the door, stepped aside, and crossed his arms, waiting in the hall. I pushed the heavy door open, my heart aching. I expected to find my grandmother sedated, terrified, and confused by her surroundings. I prepared myself to see a broken woman. Instead, Beatrice was sitting upright in a sterile vinyl chair by the reinforced window. She was not wearing a hospital gown. She was wearing her own expensive emerald green silk pajamas. She was completely calm, casually filing her nails with an emery board she had somehow managed to smuggle past the intake nurses. Beatrice paused. She blew the dust off her fingernails and looked up at me. Her eyes were not cloudy. They were crystal clear, focused, and razor sharp. "Well, Meredith," she said, a wicked, triumphant smile spreading across her face. "Did those greedy fools take the bait?" I sat down in the sterile vinyl chair opposite my grandmother, my mind struggling to process the impossible reality in front of me. "You have been faking it," I whispered, staring at the perfectly filed edge of her fingernail. "The memory lapses, the confusion, the wandering around the estate at night. You faked all of it." Beatrice set her emery board down on the small table and leaned forward. The fragile, helpless demeanor she had worn for the past 3 years vanished entirely. "I had to, Meredith. I built that $80 million real estate portfolio from the ground up after your grandfather passed away. I knew exactly what Gregory and Trey were. I knew Trey was hemorrhaging cash in his fraudulent venture capital firm, and I knew your father was a greedy parasite. But I needed them to overplay their hand. I needed them to commit a crime so undeniable, so thoroughly documented, that they could never touch my assets, or me ever again. They thought they were locking me away, but they just handed me the keys to their own prison cells." She reached into the pocket of her emerald green silk pajamas and pulled out a small encrypted black flash drive. She pressed it into my palm, her grip shockingly strong. "Trey is not the only one running a financial scam," Beatrice said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "That drive contains 30 years of your father's offshore accounting records. Gregory has been evading federal taxes, laundering money through shell companies in the Cayman Islands, and stealing from his own clients since you were in high school. I hired private forensic investigators 5 years ago to track every single penny. I kept the receipts, Meredith. Now we burn them to the ground." I gripped the flash drive, feeling a surge of adrenaline wipe away the exhaustion of the past 24 hours. My family had not just betrayed me. They were a sophisticated criminal enterprise, and they had mistakenly left the two smartest women in the bloodline alive and angry. Beatrice gave me the contact information for her actual attorney, a bulldog litigator named Harrison Cole, who had been secretly managing her affairs outside of Arthur Vance's corrupt circle. I left the psychiatric facility with a renewed sense of purpose and immediately drove to Harrison's downtown office. We spent the next 4 hours drafting an emergency injunction to halt the conservatorship. We attached sworn affidavits from 3 independent board-certified neurologists who had secretly evaluated Beatrice over the past 6 months, definitively proving she possessed full cognitive capacity and absolute financial autonomy. We marched into the federal courthouse just before the afternoon filing deadline. The tension in the marble corridors was suffocating, but walking up to the clerk's desk and formally lodging the injunction felt like striking a match in a powder keg. By the time the judge reviewed our filings and issued the emergency stay, Gregory and Trey's fraudulent medical proxy was officially frozen. They could not touch a single cent of the $80 million trust. We had won the first battle. I walked out of the heavy brass doors of the courthouse, the afternoon sun feeling warm against my face for the first time in days. I pulled my phone out of my blazer pocket to call Beatrice and deliver the good news. Before I could dial her number, my screen lit up with a frantic text message from Sydney. My blood ran cold. The message contained a grainy, terrifying photograph of a massive handful of prescription painkillers scattered across a white marble countertop. Beneath the image was a block of desperate, jagged text. "I cannot do this anymore, Meredith. Trey lost all the money. Dad is screaming. They are blaming me for the video. I am so scared. I am sorry for everything I did to you. Tell Mom I love her. Goodbye." My breath caught in my throat. I stared at the horrifying image of the pills. Sydney was a chronic liar, a narcissist, and a master manipulator who had just tried to destroy my career on social media less than 48 hours ago. Every logical instinct in my brain screamed that this was another trap, another calculated performance designed to pull me back into the family chaos. But she was still my little sister. The thought of her lying unconscious on a bathroom floor, desperate and terrified because Trey's Ponzi scheme was collapsing, overrode every ounce of my professional caution. If there was even a 1% chance that she was actually going to end her life, I could not ignore it. I could not let her die. I sprinted to my car, threw it into drive, and sped toward her luxury downtown penthouse. The drive was a chaotic blur of red lights, blaring horns, and white-knuckle panic. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my hands ached, praying I would not be too late. I slammed the brakes, abandoning my car in the loading zone of her high-rise building. I bypassed the concierge, slipped into the resident elevator behind a delivery worker, and rode up to the top floor. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs as I sprinted down the carpeted hallway toward her unit. The heavy mahogany door to her penthouse was slightly ajar. "Sydney!" I screamed, shoving the door open and rushing into the massive foyer. I ran straight toward the kitchen, expecting to find her collapsed on the floor. I stopped dead in my tracks. The penthouse was immaculate. The white marble countertops were completely clear. There were no scattered pills. There was no suicide note. There was no dying sister. Instead, two uniformed police officers stepped out from the adjacent dining room, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. They stared at me with hard, suspicious eyes. Before I could even process the empty countertops, my mother Carolyn stepped out from behind the officers. She was clutching a tissue, her face pale, performing the role of a terrified, devastated mother with absolute perfection. Carolyn pointed a shaking finger directly at my chest. "Arrest her!" my mother cried out, her voice echoing shrilly against the vaulted ceilings. She broke in to attack my pregnant daughter. The interrogation room was freezing, the air thick with the smell of cheap coffee and stale floor wax. I sat in the hard plastic chair, my hands folded calmly on the metal table. Across from me, Detective Miller was reviewing the statement my mother had just signed. It was a masterpiece of fiction, claiming I had forced my way into the penthouse, assaulted a pregnant woman, and threatened the safety of my own sister. I waited until he looked up, his eyes weary and skeptical. "Detective? I understand why you have to take this complaint seriously," I said, my voice measured and devoid of the panic they expected. "But before you process any charges, I need you to pull up the timestamp and the server metadata on the text message Sydney sent me, the one with the image of the pills." Miller frowned, tapping his pen against the folder. "That is part of our standard evidence collection, Ms. Vance. Why?" "Because it is a fabrication," I replied, leaning forward into the light. "I work in forensic financial consulting. I know how digital footprints work. Trey, my brother, didn't just tell Sydney to send that message. He used an offshore spoofing application routed through a server in the Cayman Islands to mimic her device's signature. That text wasn't sent from the penthouse. It was sent from a burner phone in a basement in the Caribbean. If you run a deep packet inspection on that message header, you will find a non-local IP address that links directly to the same shell company that holds the $12 million in fraudulent debt against my social security number." Miller looked at me for a long, silent moment. He stood up and walked out of the room, leaving me alone with the buzzing fluorescent light. I didn't breathe until he returned 10 minutes later. He wasn't alone. He was holding his tablet, and the expression on his face had shifted from cold professional duty to something bordering on professional awe. "You were right about the IP address," Miller said, his voice lowering. "The server trace leads back to a holding company called VCAP Holdings, the same firm that filed the initial complaint about you." The detective turned to the door, signaling to the officer waiting in the hall. "We are dropping the charges," Miller said. "There is no evidence of a break-in, and the victim or whoever sent that text has vanished. We have the logs, and we have enough to start a preliminary inquiry into your brother's business practices. You are free to go, Meredith. But be careful. If this firm is using offshore servers to manufacture evidence, they are playing a very dangerous game." I thanked him, grabbed my leather bag, and walked out of the precinct into the cool, damp night. I had won this round, but I knew the game was far from over. I felt the familiar weight of the flash drive in my pocket, the one Beatrice had given me, containing decades of Gregory's tax evasion records. I had the leverage now. I had the proof to dismantle their entire world. I climbed into my car, the interior still smelling like stale motel air. My hands didn't tremble this time. I felt a cold, calculated clarity. I was going to beat them at their own game. I pulled my phone out to call Beatrice's attorney and coordinate the next phase of the trust transfer. As the banking app finished its login sequence, a bright flashing notification banner consumed the screen. System alert, account access restricted. My heart didn't just skip a beat. It felt like it had been physically removed from my chest. I tapped the alert, my fingers flying across the glass, trying to navigate to the portfolio dashboard. Access denied. I tried my secondary savings account. Denied. I tried the account that held the emergency fund I had spent 5 years building. Zero. The screen displayed a balance of exactly $0. I navigated to the legal notice attached to the alert. A local judge, one of Gregory's long-term country club associates, had signed an emergency ex parte injunction an hour ago, based on the fraudulent claim that I was an unstable litigious individual attempting to liquidate family assets before a conservatorship hearing. Every single one of my liquid accounts was frozen. I sat in the darkness of the parking lot, the engine idling, staring at the empty screen. They had stripped me of my job, my reputation, my identity, and now my ability to pay for the legal defense I needed to win this war. I had the truth, I had the evidence, and I had the flash drive, but I was legally and financially completely bankrupt. I looked at the fuel gauge on my dashboard. Empty. I looked at the glove box. Empty. Trey and Gregory had finally succeeded in cornering me. They hadn't just taken my money, they had effectively deleted me from the financial world. I was a ghost with a flash drive sitting in a car that wouldn't make it to the state line. I took a deep breath and looked up at the stars, trying to find some semblance of a plan in the void. They had played their strongest card, but they had forgotten one fundamental truth about me. I wasn't just a wealth manager. I was the woman who had grown up watching my father steal from me, and I had learned how to survive on absolutely nothing. I started the engine, prayed the fuel pump wouldn't fail, and pulled out of the parking lot. I didn't need a bank account to expose them. I just needed a way to get the data to someone who couldn't be bought. The engine of my car sputtered, the low fuel light glaring at me like a mocking yellow eye. I sat in the desolate police precinct parking lot, completely stripped of my digital existence. My bank accounts were frozen. My credit cards were deactivated. Gregory and Trey had weaponized the legal system to starve me out. They wanted me destitute, panicked, and crawling back to them on my knees. I closed my eyes and tuned out the buzzing streetlights. I needed an analog solution to a digital lockdown. I forced my mind back to the psychiatric ward, to the exact moment Beatrice had pressed the flash drive into my palm. She had pulled me into a fierce, surprisingly strong embrace, her lips brushing my ear. She had whispered a sequence, not a warning but a lifeline. Alpha 749er. Delaware Independent Depository. Box 814. Passcode the exact date your grandfather bought his first commercial lot. Beatrice never trusted the digital grid. She was a woman who built her empire in an era of paper trails and physical vaults. If she had an offshore safety deposit box hidden in Wilmington, Delaware, the corporate secrecy capital of the United States, it held something powerful enough to end this war. But Delaware was hundreds of miles away, and I did not even have the gas money to make it to the state line. I looked down at my hands. The platinum band of my diamond wedding ring caught the faint parking lot light. Beside it, on my left wrist, sat a customized Patek Philippe watch, a luxury timepiece I had purchased to celebrate my first major corporate promotion. They were symbols of a life that no longer existed, a marriage that was a lie, and a career my family had actively destroyed. I put the car in drive and pulled out into the deserted streets. I did not waste time mourning the past. I drove straight to a 24-hour high-security pawn shop located on the gritty edge of the city district. The neon signs flickered against the cracked pavement. I walked inside, ignoring the heavy stare of the armed security guard. The pawnbroker, a cynical man sitting behind bulletproof glass, barely looked up from his tablet. I unclasped the Patek Philippe and slid it through the transaction slot, followed immediately by my wedding ring. The pawnbroker picked up his jeweler loupe. He examined the watch, first his eyebrows raising a fraction of an inch. He checked the serial number, then moved to the diamond ring. "I will give you 3,000 for the pair," he grunted, clearly expecting me to negotiate from a position of absolute desperation. I leaned forward, tapping the thick glass with my index finger. The watch retails for $45,000 and has a pristine service record. The diamond is a flawless 2-carat princess cut, set in pure platinum. I am not here to haggle with you over pennies. I need $8,000 in unmarked, untraceable cash right now. You turn around and sell those to your private buyers tomorrow, you will triple your money by noon. Do we have a deal, or do I walk down the street to your competitor? He stared at me, recognizing the absolute lack of fear in my voice. He opened his cash drawer and counted out $8,000 in crisp $100 bills. I took the money, walked back to my dying car, and drove directly to the international airport. I abandoned the vehicle in long-term parking, knowing it would likely be towed before I ever returned. I walked up to the ticketing counter, paid cash for the first available red-eye flight to Philadelphia, and boarded the plane with nothing but the clothes on my back and the flash drive in my pocket. From Philadelphia, I took a commuter train straight into Wilmington, Delaware. The city was a sprawling hub of anonymous shell companies and corporate tax havens. I navigated the busy morning streets until I found the Delaware Independent Depository. It was a nondescript, windowless limestone building guarded by discreet cameras and heavy steel doors. I walked into the silent, climate-controlled lobby. The attendant behind the polished marble desk asked for my identification. I handed over my driver license, praying the judicial freeze on my finances had not flagged my identity in their private localized system. I am here to access Box 814, I stated clearly. The attendant typed my name into his terminal. He nodded, pulling a biometric scanner onto the counter. Your grandmother designated you as the sole secondary proxy 3 years ago. Please place your hand on the scanner and state the access phrase. I pressed my palm against the glass. October 12th, 1978. I said, repeating the date my grandfather closed his first real estate deal. The machine chimed a pleasant green. The attendant stood up, gesturing for me to follow him. He led me through a heavy vault door and into a private windowless viewing room. He placed a long, heavy steel lockbox onto the table, bowed his head, and left me completely alone. I took a deep breath. I expected to lift the lid and find stacks of bearer bonds, emergency cash, or gold reserves. I needed untraceable funds to hire Harrison Cole and fight the conservatorship in federal court. I flipped the heavy brass latches and opened the lid. The box was entirely devoid of money. Instead, it was packed with thick, yellowed manila folders. A sense of crushing disappointment washed over me for a fraction of a second before my investigative instincts kicked in. Beatrice did not leave me money. She left me ammunition. I pulled out the first file. The label read simply Trey. I opened the folder and began spreading the documents across the polished steel table. My heart began to pound against my ribs as I read through original birth certificates, sealed court transcripts, and deeply buried financial disclosures. Trey had spent his entire life leveraging his supposedly elite, affluent African-American lineage. He used that narrative to build his venture capital firm, secure institutional investors, and command absolute authority within our family social circles. He painted himself as the brilliant, highly educated heir to a generational dynasty. Every single word of his history was a calculated, manufactured lie. The documents staring back at me proved that the man calling himself Trey Vance did not exist before 10 years ago. His real name was Marcus Thorne. He was not born into wealth. He had grown up in Nevada, bouncing between state systems before landing a mid-level accounting job. The court transcripts detailed a massive multi-million-dollar corporate embezzlement charge brought against Marcus Thorne exactly 10 years ago. The evidence was overwhelming. He had been weeks away from a 20-year federal prison sentence when he completely vanished. He had fled the state, legally changed his identity through a corrupt proxy, fabricated his entire elite academic and social background, and embedded himself into my father's inner circle. Gregory had not just handed his retirement portfolio over to a bad investor. He had handed it over to a seasoned fugitive felon. I stared at the original signed plea agreements bearing Trey's actual signature. I did not just have the ledgers proving his current Ponzi scheme. I had the absolute, undeniable proof that his entire existence was a federal crime. I carefully placed the original Marcus Thorne court transcripts and the forged identity documents into a waterproof envelope. I did not take the originals with me. I walked straight from the depository to a local shipping center, overnighting the physical evidence to Harrison Cole using a fake return address. I kept only the high-resolution digital scans on the encrypted flash drive securely tucked into my bra. The physical proof was safe. Now I just had to deliver the execution. 4 days later, the scent of roasted sage and black truffles wafted down the sweeping driveway of the family estate. Thanksgiving was never about gratitude for my parents. It was a fiscal quarter review wrapped in holiday aesthetics. Valets in crisp black uniforms jogged back and forth, parking a parade of Bentleys and imported sports cars. Gregory and Carolyn were hosting their annual autumn gala, a massive catered affair designed to dazzle their high society peers and, more importantly, pacify Trey's increasingly anxious venture capital investors. I walked up the long gravel driveway on foot. I had deliberately completely abandoned my usual tailored armor. I wore a faded beige sweater that hung loosely off my shoulders, scuffed flat shoes, and cheap slacks. I forced my posture to slump, letting my shoulders round inward. I stripped every ounce of confidence from my face, replacing it with the hollow, exhausted stare of a woman who had finally been broken by the world. I pushed open the heavy mahogany front doors. The great room was a sea of cocktail dresses, bespoke suits, and clinking crystal flutes. A string quartet played softly in the corner. Gregory stood by the grand fireplace holding court with a group of banking executives. Trey was near the catered buffet, smoothly pitching a tech valuation to a circle of wealthy older men. The moment I stepped onto the marble foyer, the ambient chatter began to die. Heads turned. The string quartet seemed to lower their volume. Carolyn spotted me first. She was wearing a stunning crimson gown, a champagne flute gripped tightly in her hand. Her eyes swept over my unkempt hair, my cheap clothes, and my defeated posture. A slow, predatory smile spread across her perfectly contoured face. She did not see a threat. She saw a trophy. "Well, look who finally found her way home," Carolyn announced, her voice pitched loud enough to ensure the entire room stopped to listen. Gregory scowled, excusing himself from his circle to step forward. Trey simply crossed his arms, his chest puffing out with absolute arrogance. Sydney emerged from the dining room, her pregnant belly clad in a tight silk maternity dress, a smug sneer instantly forming on her lips. I kept my eyes fixed on the floor, shifting my weight nervously. "I have nowhere else to go," I said, keeping my voice barely above a whisper, ensuring they had to strain to hear my submission. "My accounts are frozen. I have nothing." Carolyn let out a sharp musical laugh that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. She stepped right up to me, fully aware of the billionaire investors watching this display of maternal dominance. "We warned you, Meredith," Carolyn said, projecting her voice to the gallery. "We told you that your reckless independence and your corporate paranoia would ruin you. You tried to destroy your own family, and now look at you. Destitute, crawling back to the people you so viciously attacked." I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted blood, forcing myself to nod. "I am sorry," I whispered. "You were right. I lost everything." Sydney walked up beside my mother, resting a hand on her stomach. "It is really pathetic," Sydney chimed in, tossing her hair over her shoulder. "But honestly, Mom, I feel bad for her. It is Thanksgiving. We should not leave her out in the cold like a stray dog." Carolyn tapped her chin, feigning deep, benevolent thought. The wealthy guests murmured their approval of Carolyn's supposed grace. "You are right, Sydney. We are a forgiving family." Carolyn turned her gaze back to me, her eyes glittering with pure malice. "We will take you in, Meredith, but you have to earn your keep. You are clearly entirely unfit for the corporate world, but Sydney is going to need help with the new baby. You can move into the small room above the garage. You will be Sydney's live-in nanny and housekeeper. You will clean her penthouse, wash the baby bottles, and handle her errands." A few gasps rippled through the crowd. It was a breathtaking public humiliation. A senior wealth management executive reduced to a maid for the sister who had actively conspired to ruin her life. I looked up, meeting Carolyn's triumphant stare. I let a single pathetic tear slide down my cheek. "Thank you, Mother," I said softly. I appreciate the charity. I will go make myself useful right now. Trey barked a laugh, turning back to his investors. Gregory nodded in grim satisfaction, the ultimate patriarch, restoring order to his house. Carolyn waved her hand dismissively, pointing toward a passing catering waiter. Grab a towel and start pouring the wine, Meredith Carolyn commanded. Do not just stand there taking up space. I grabbed a crisp white linen towel and a bottle of expensive vintage Bordeaux from the catering station. I lowered my head and began weaving silently through the room. They had entirely dismissed me. I was no longer a person to them. I was a prop in their victory lap. They ignored me completely as I refilled glasses and cleared empty appetizer plates. I navigated the room with practiced invisibility until I reached the back corner near the floor-to-ceiling windows. There, standing slightly apart from the sycophants, was Arthur Sterling. He was the white whale of Trey's venture capital fund, a ruthless old money billionaire whose massive institutional investment was the only thing keeping Trey's Ponzi scheme from imploding into dust. Arthur was a man who famously despised liars and demanded absolute fiscal transparency. I approached him from the side, keeping my head bowed respectfully. I lifted the heavy glass bottle and began pouring the dark red wine into his crystal goblet. Arthur did not even look at me. He kept his eyes on Trey across the room, analyzing him with a cold, calculating stare. I leaned in just a fraction of an inch, keeping the bottle perfectly steady. I pitched my voice low, ensuring the sound would travel only to his ears. "Do not write the next check, Mr. Sterling," I whispered softly, never breaking the rhythm of the pour. Instead, ask Trey why his primary Delaware holding LLC shares the exact same federal tax ID number as a bankrupt corporate shell company registered to a convicted embezzler in Nevada from 2014. Arthur went completely rigid. His hand tightened around the stem of his wine glass. He did not look at me. He did not gasp. But I saw the immediate violent shift in his jawline. I finished the pour, gave a polite, subservient nod, and melted back into the crowd of glittering guests. I retreated to the shadows of the grand foyer, holding my silver serving tray tightly against my chest, and waited. I did not have to wait long. Arthur Sterling was not a man who operated on blind faith. He was a creature of absolute empirical data. From across the room, I watched him pull a sleek black smartphone from his tailored jacket. He did not look angry. He looked entirely devoid of emotion, which was far more dangerous. He tapped out a swift message, likely summoning his offshore compliance team. Less than 3 minutes later, his phone buzzed. Arthur looked at the screen. The muscles in his jaw tightened into a rigid, unforgiving line. He had his confirmation. At the center of the great room, Gregory was clinking his spoon against his crystal champagne flute. The gentle melodic chime cut through the ambient chatter, signaling the room to quiet down. The string quartet faded out, on a lingering, elegant chord. Carolyn stepped up beside her husband, wrapping her arm through his, projecting the absolute pinnacle of high society matriarchy. Trey stood just to their right, holding a glass of scotch, wearing the smug, satisfied expression of a man who believed he owned the world. "Thank you all for joining our family on this day of gratitude," Gregory boomed, his voice resonating with practiced patriarchal authority. "We have much to be thankful for this year. Our health, our wonderful friends, and the continued unparalleled success of my brilliant son Trey. His venture capital firm has redefined market growth, and we are thrilled to share this prosperity with so many of you tonight." Gregory raised his glass. Before anyone could echo the toast, a voice cut through the silence like a cracking whip. "Before we drink to your son Gregory, I have a brief question regarding his prosperity." The crowd parted instantly as Arthur Sterling stepped forward. He did not raise his voice, but the absolute freezing authority in his tone made the entire room hold its breath. Arthur walked directly up to Trey, stopping mere inches from him. Trey offered a confident, easy smile, completely unaware of the guillotine swinging down toward his neck. "Arthur, please," Trey said smoothly. "We can discuss quarterly projections on Monday. Tonight is about family." "Tonight is about fraud," Arthur replied. A collective sharp intake of breath swept through the high society guests. Carolyn let out a tiny scandalized gasp. Gregory lowered his champagne flute, his face flushing with immediate defensive anger. "I do not know what kind of joke this is," Arthur Gregory started, "but you are out of line." Arthur ignored my father entirely. He kept his dead, calculating eyes locked directly on my brother. "Why does your primary Delaware holding company, VCAP Holdings, share the exact same federal tax identification number as a defunct bankrupt corporate shell registered in Nevada from 2014, a shell company owned by a convicted embezzler named Marcus Thorne?" The silence that followed was absolute, terrifying, and profound. I watched Trey from my corner. The transformation was instantaneous and violent. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him a sickly ashen gray. His confident posture crumbled. His eyes darted wildly around the room, looking for an exit, looking for an excuse, looking for anything to save him. He opened his mouth, but the smooth, charismatic venture capitalist was gone. He stammered a pathetic, garbled sound escaping his throat. "Arthur, that is a clerical error." Trey choked out, his voice cracking. "It is a filing glitch with the registered agent. I can have my compliance team look at the ledger." "I do not let felons manage my capital," Arthur stated. His voice was loud enough for every single banking executive, socialite, and investor in the room to hear clearly. "I am pulling my funding. Every single cent, effective immediately. You will be hearing from federal authorities by morning." Arthur turned on his heel and walked straight out the front doors. It was as if someone had fired a starting pistol. The room erupted into absolute chaos. The elite guests, terrified of being associated with a collapsing Ponzi scheme and a federal investigation, scrambled for the coat check. Billionaire investors shoved past each other, pulling out their phones, frantically dialing their attorneys and financial advisors. The great room emptied in less than 10 minutes, leaving behind half-finished glasses of champagne and a deafening, ringing silence. Carolyn stood in the center of the wreckage, her hands visibly shaking. She looked around at her ruined gala, her face contorted in sheer horror. Sydney was clutching her pregnant stomach, hyperventilating near the buffet table. Gregory rounded on Trey, his face purple with rage. What the hell was he talking about, Trey? What is a Nevada shell company? What did you do? Trey was pacing the floor like a caged animal. He was sweating profusely, tugging at his expensive silk tie until it came loose. The polished elite veneer was entirely gone, replaced by the desperate feral panic of a cornered criminal. "It is a liquidity squeeze," Trey shouted, his voice shrill and frantic. Arthur, pulling his capital, just triggered an automatic margin call across the entire portfolio. "The institutional lenders are going to demand cash by midnight or they seize the assets. I need capital, Dad. I need cash right now." Gregory stared at him, absolute shock warring with rising panic. "I have no cash, you know that. I liquidated my entire retirement portfolio and wired it to your fund last month. Then leveraged the estate," Trey demanded, stepping aggressively toward my father. "Take out a fourth mortgage on this mansion. Call your private wealth broker right now. We can bridge the gap. We just need $10 million to float the margin call until I can shift the offshore accounts." Gregory stepped back, genuine fear finally breaking through his arrogant exterior. "Are you out of your mind? I am not taking out another mortgage. The house is the only clean asset I have left. I am not risking my home for your mistakes. You fix this, Trey. You fix this right now." Trey stopped pacing. He stood perfectly still in the center of the ruined gala. He looked at Gregory, then at Carolyn, then at Sydney. The desperate panic in his eyes hardened into something venomous, cruel, and completely ruthless. The illusion of Trey Vance, the perfect Ivy League-educated son, shattered entirely. The man standing in the living room was Marcus Thorne. "You do not understand, old man Trey," snarled, his voice dropping the refined, educated accent he had faked for a decade. "I am not asking for your permission. I am telling you what has already been done." Gregory froze. "What do you mean?" "I forged your signature," Trey screamed, his voice echoing off the marble walls. "I forged your digital signature and mortgaged this entire estate 30 days ago to cover my third quarter losses. The money is already gone. This house does not belong to you anymore, Gregory. It belongs to the bank." The Thanksgiving gala had ended in a symphony of shattered crystal and guttural screaming. Gregory's roar of pure, unfiltered rage as he realized he was legally homeless still echoed in my ears weeks later. But Trey was a cornered animal, and cornered animals do not simply surrender, they lash out. Using a combination of aggressive legal stalling and desperate promises, he had managed to hold off the institutional lenders just long enough to fast-track the conservatorship hearing. His final, utterly ruthless play was to seize control of Beatrice and her $80 million trust. It was the only pool of liquid capital large enough to cover his fraudulent mortgages, pay off the margin calls, and keep him out of federal prison. The heavy mahogany doors of the federal probate court swung shut, sealing us inside a room that smelled of floor wax and old paper. The air was thick and suffocating. I sat at the plaintiff table beside Harrison Cole, the formidable attorney I had hired with the pawnshop cash. Across the aisle at the defense table sat Trey, Sidney, and Carolyn. Gregory was conspicuously absent, likely barricaded in his stolen mansion with a team of bankruptcy lawyers fighting a war he had already lost. Trey looked immaculate. He wore a conservative navy suit, his posture radiating calm, respectful authority. He did not look like a man whose venture capital firm was secretly hemorrhaging millions. He looked like an embattled patriarch fighting to protect his family. In a move of sheer arrogant brilliance, Trey had filed a motion to act as his own co-counsel alongside Carolyn's high-priced estate lawyers. He wanted the floor. He wanted to control the narrative. When Judge Aris, a stern man with 30 years on the bench, called the hearing to order, Trey stood up and approached the podium. He did not bring notes. He did not look at the legal files. He looked directly at the judge, his face an absolute mask of sorrow and heavy burden. "Your Honor." Trey began, his voice smooth, resonant, and perfectly pitched to convey deep emotional pain. "We are here today because of a tragedy, but not the tragedy of my grandmother's declining health. We are here because of the tragedy of jealousy." Trey gripped the edges of the podium, leaning forward. He began to weave a masterpiece of absolute fiction. He spoke about his upbringing, weaponizing the very truth I had discovered in the Delaware vault. He painted a picture of a young self-made black man who had fought tooth and nail against a system designed to keep him down. He spoke of the sleepless nights, the prejudice he had overcome in the venture capital world, and the empire he had built through sheer unyielding determination to provide for his family and his pregnant wife. He gestured gracefully towards Sidney, who expertly placed a protective hand over her swollen belly, her eyes wide and misting with tears. Carolyn sat beside her, dabbing at her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. It was a flawless, highly choreographed performance. Then Trey turned his gaze toward me, pointing a steady, accusing finger. "And then there is my sister Meredith Trey," said his voice hardening with righteous disappointment. "A woman who was handed every corporate privilege. A woman who worked in the comfortable, insulated towers of forensic finance, completely shielded from the struggles I faced. When she was terminated from her firm for erratic, unstable behavior, we tried to welcome her home. We offered her shelter. We offered her grace. But Meredith could not stand to see my success. She could not stand that the brother she always looked down upon had built something greater than she ever could." I sat perfectly still, my hands folded on the table. Harrison Cole shifted beside me, making a quick note on his legal pad, completely unfazed by the theatrical display. Trey let out a heavy, shuddering sigh, dropping his head for a fraction of a second before looking back at the judge. He let a single perfect tear escape, catching the harsh fluorescent light of the courtroom. "Your Honor, Meredith is attempting to weaponize our beloved grandmother against us. She is using her corporate privilege and her financial manipulation tactics to hijack an $80 million trust out of pure vindictive spite. She is trying to destroy a self-made black man and tear a loving family apart because she has nothing left of her own. I am begging this court to grant me conservatorship over Beatrice to protect my grandmother's legacy from a bitter, unstable woman who will not stop until everything we have built is burned to the ground." Trey stepped back from the podium and returned to his seat. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. It was the most compelling, manipulative piece of gaslighting I had ever witnessed. He had seamlessly blended race class and family duty into an impenetrable shield, casting himself as the ultimate victim of my supposed corporate malice. I looked up at the bench. Judge Aris was leaning forward, his hands clasped together. His expression was visibly moved. He looked at Trey with deep respect, then glanced sympathetically at Sydney and her pregnant belly. Finally, the judge slowly turned his gaze toward my table. The warmth entirely vanished from his face, replaced by a cold, hardened glare. He looked at me not as a concerned granddaughter, but as a hostile, destructive threat to a respectable family. Ms. Meredith, Judge Aris said, his voice dropping into a harsh, warning tone. This court does not look kindly on bitter siblings attacking their family's hard-earned success. The heavy silence in the courtroom felt absolute following Judge Aris's reprimand. I felt the collective gaze of the room bearing down on me, heavy with judgment and manufactured pity. Sydney was dabbing her eyes with a tissue, playing the distressed pregnant wife to perfection. Carolyn had her chin tilted up in a portrait of wounded maternal grace, a martyr to my supposed cruelty. Trey wore the solemn, patient expression of a saint enduring persecution, shaking his head slowly as if praying for my soul. I did not break eye contact with the judge. I did not shed a single tear. I did not offer a trembling emotional defense of my character. I simply stood up, smoothing the front of my inexpensive beige sweater, and turned to my attorney. Your Honor, Harrison Cole said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that demanded immediate attention. The defense has presented a highly compelling emotional narrative. We, however, would like to present the math. We request permission to enter Plaintiff Exhibits A through G into the record via visual projection. Judge Aris frowned, his skepticism radiating from the elevated bench, but he gave a curt nod. Proceed, counselor. But keep this strictly relevant to the conservatorship of Beatrice Vance. I stepped out from behind the heavy oak plaintiff table. Harrison smoothly wheeled a digital projector into the center of the floor, connecting it to a secure encrypted laptop. I did not look at my family. I focused entirely on the blank white wall beside the witness stand. I pressed a button on the remote, and the dim courtroom was suddenly illuminated by the stark, undeniable reality of a forensic balance sheet. Your Honor. I began, my voice ringing clear and completely devoid of any emotional inflection. This hearing is to determine the fiscal safety of my grandmother and her $80 million trust. To understand the immediate threat to that trust, we must examine the current financial trajectory of the man petitioning to control it. Let us follow the capital. I clicked the remote. Exhibit A flashed onto the wall. It was a dense network of wire transfers highlighted in bright, glaring red. This is the personal retirement portfolio of Gregory Vance, I stated, pointing a laser at the top of the screen. 30 days ago, it was valued at $12.4 million. On the morning of November 4th, the defendant initiated a series of aggressive wire transfers. He moved those funds through 3 separate intermediary accounts in the British Virgin Islands. The money was washed, divided, and deposited directly into a primary holding LLC registered in Delaware. Gregory stiffened in the gallery. Carolyn's head snapped toward her husband, her flawless, stoic mask cracking for a fraction of a second. I clicked the remote again. Exhibit B appeared. It was a complex digital map of offshore routing nodes and server ping logs. When my brother claimed I was erratic and unstable, he pointed to a series of fraudulent debts taken out against my social security number. I continued my pace, quickening, building a relentless, rapid-fire rhythm. He claimed I was financially incompetent, but deep packet network inspections reveal that the IP addresses used to generate those debts did not originate from my devices. They originated from a spoofed server in the Cayman Islands. A server leased and paid for by that exact same Delaware LLC. Objection, Trey shouted, leaping to his feet, his calm demeanor slipping. This is fabricated digital evidence. She is trying to confuse the court with technical jargon and baseless conspiracy theories. Overruled. Judge Aris barked, his eyes now glued to the projector screen. The paternal sympathy had vanished from his face, replaced by the sharp, predatory focus of a seasoned jurist smelling blood in the water. Proceed, Ms. Meredith. I did not miss a beat. I clicked to Exhibit C. The screen displayed a massive, sprawling schematic of Trey's venture capital fund, cross-referenced with institutional loan documents. This is VCAP Holdings, I said, staring directly at Trey now. The fund my brother claims is a testament to his self-made success, but the math tells a very different story. The fund is entirely illiquid. It is currently facing margin calls across 3 separate institutional lenders. It is short exactly $42 million as of yesterday evening. My brother did not petition for conservatorship out of familial love, Your Honor. He petitioned because Beatrice Vance's trust is the only pool of liquid capital large enough to stop his impending federal indictment for wire fraud. He built a pipeline to siphon her wealth the second you grant him the legal authority to do so. The courtroom erupted into frantic whispers. Carolyn gripped the edge of her wooden table, her knuckles turning bone white. Sydney looked at Trey, sheer unadulterated panic bleeding into her eyes as the reality of her husband's bankruptcy washed over her. Trey was gripping the defense podium so hard the wood groaned in protest. "Your Honor, this is an absolute outrage," Trey stammered, his polished, educated accent slipping entirely. "She is spinning a web of lies. She has absolutely zero proof regarding the ownership of that Delaware shell company. It could belong to anyone." I waited for the exact right moment. I waited until the entire room hung on his desperate denial. Then I reached into my pocket and pulled out the thick waterproof envelope I had overnighted from the Delaware depository. Harrison Cole took the physical documents, holding them up for the judge to see while I brought up the high-resolution scans on the projector. "Exhibit D," I announced, letting my voice drop to a deadly quiet register. The original incorporation documents and tax filings for the Delaware LLC in question. The image on the wall displayed a standard corporate registration form, but the bold black text in the center of the screen was inescapable. "As you can see, Your Honor." The tax identification number for the entity currently draining, Gregory Vance's accounts forging my identity, and attempting to seize Beatrice Vance's trust, does not belong to Trey Vance. It belongs to a man named Marcus Thorne. Judge Aris leaned forward, peering over his spectacles, the color draining from his cheeks. "And who is Marcus Thorne?" "Marcus." I clicked to the final slide. Exhibit E. The screen exploded with sealed court transcripts, original Nevada birth certificates, and a federal plea agreement dated 10 years ago. "Marcus Thorne is a fugitive felon," I stated, the words striking the silent room like physical blows. "He was indicted for a multi-million-dollar corporate embezzlement scheme in Nevada exactly 10 years ago. He fled the state weeks before sentencing, forged a new identity, fabricated an elite academic history, and embedded himself into my family under the name Trey Vance. The man petitioning this court for control of $80 million does not exist." The silence lasted exactly 1 second, then the facade completely obliterated. "Shut up," Trey roared. The sound was not human. It was the guttural, violent shriek of a cornered predator. He vaulted over the heavy wooden defense table, sending legal briefs, laptops, and water pitchers flying across the polished floor. Sydney screamed, scrambling backward as Trey kicked a chair out of his way, completely abandoning his pregnant wife. He did not look like an Ivy League venture capitalist anymore. His eyes were wide and manic, his face twisted into a mask of pure homicidal rage. He charged across the open aisle, launching his entire body toward the center of the room. He slammed into the metal cart, smashing the expensive digital projector onto the marble floor in a shower of sparks and broken plastic. Bailiff Judge Aris bellowed, slamming his gavel down repeatedly. "Secure the courtroom." Trey ignored the judge, the guards, and the screaming gallery. He spun around his chest, heaving his fists balled tightly at his sides. He locked eyes with me, lunging forward with a terrifying, unhinged speed. He screamed a string of vicious, degrading obscenities that echoed off the vaulted ceilings, desperately trying to physically tear apart the woman who had just dismantled his entire manufactured existence. 2 heavy-set court bailiffs slammed into Trey before his outstretched hands could reach my throat. The sheer force of the impact sent all 3 men crashing into the wooden divider, separating the gallery from the floor. The heavy oak splintered. Trey thrashed wildly against the officers, his expensive, tailored suit tearing at the shoulder. He kicked, he spat, and he roared, his voice cracking into a feral, unrecognizable shriek. The polished Ivy League venture capitalist was entirely gone, replaced by Marcus Thorne, the violent, desperate fugitive I had just exposed. Judge Aris hammered his gavel with deafening force, standing up behind the elevated bench. "Secure that man and remove him from my courtroom immediately." The sharp, metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut echoed over Trey's obscenities. The bailiffs hauled him to his feet, twisting his arms behind his back. He continued to scream degrading threats at me as they dragged him backward down the center aisle, his expensive leather shoes leaving scuff marks on the polished marble. The heavy double doors swung shut behind them, cutting off his frantic howling, leaving the courtroom ringing with a stunned, electrified silence. I remained standing at the plaintiff table. I did not flinch. I did not adjust my posture. Harrison Cole stood beside me, calmly picking up a piece of the shattered plastic from the destroyed projector, a silent testament to the absolute truth of our presentation. Across the aisle, the defense table was a scene of absolute devastation. Sydney was hyperventilating, clutching her pregnant stomach, her eyes wide with the horrifying realization that the father of her child was a fugitive felon, currently being booked into federal custody. The estate lawyers Gregory had hired at exorbitant rates were hastily packing their briefcases, frantically whispering to each other, clearly preparing to withdraw as counsel before the federal indictments began raining down. But Carolyn did not move. She sat perfectly rigid, her eyes locked on the spot where Trey had just been tackled. I watched the frantic calculations running behind her eyes. The Delaware Shell Company was exposed. Gregory's retirement was gone. The mansion was seized by institutional lenders. Trey was on his way to federal prison. The $80 million trust of Beatrice Vance was the last remaining life raft, and it was rapidly pulling away from her grasp. Carolyn stood up. She shoved her chair back with such force it tipped over and crashed to the floor. The flawless, stoic mask of the high society matriarch shattered completely. She did not look at her weeping daughter-in-law. She did not consult her fleeing attorneys. She marched directly toward the witness stand. Her silk blouse wrinkled, her perfect hair slightly unspooled. "Your Honor, I demand to be heard," Carolyn declared, her voice shrill and trembling with a manic, desperate energy. Judge Aris looked at her with a mixture of pity and deep disgust. "Mrs. Vance, your co-counsel, has just been removed from this courtroom under arrest. I strongly suggest you consult with your remaining attorneys before you say another word on the record." "I do not need an attorney to speak the truth about my own family," Carolyn snapped, gripping the wooden railing of the witness box. Her eyes darted wildly before locking onto me. The sheer venomous hatred radiating from her face was palpable. "She is the one you should be arresting. She is the one tearing this family apart piece by piece. Mrs. Vance, I will not warn you again," Judge Aris said, his voice dropping to a dangerous baritone. "This court has just seen undeniable forensic proof of massive financial fraud committed by the man you brought in here to take control of an $80 million estate. Do not test my patience." Carolyn completely ignored the warning. The money was slipping away, and she was willing to burn the entire world down to stop me from getting it. She leaned over the railing, pointing a shaking, manicured finger directly at my chest. "You think she is some innocent victim?" Carolyn sneered, addressing the judge but keeping her hateful gaze fixed on me. "You think she is a savior trying to protect Beatrice? She is a parasite. She has always been a parasite. I had to protect my family from her. I had to do whatever it took to keep her from destroying us." Harrison Cole stepped forward. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular and completely irrelevant to the forensic evidence of fraud." "Let her speak, Harrison," I said quietly. My voice carried clearly across the silent room. "Let her put it on the record." Carolyn let out a harsh, breathless laugh. "You want it on the record? Fine, I will gladly put it on the record. You wonder why your life was a constant string of failures, Meredith. You wonder why you were fired from your first 3 accounting firms despite your perfect grades. It was not bad luck. It was me." I stared at her, the air leaving my lungs. The unexplained terminations in my early 20s. The senior partners who had suddenly turned cold and hostile without explanation. "I called the managing partners," Carolyn boasted, her voice echoing with twisted pride. I told them you were stealing from our family accounts. I told them you were struggling with severe addiction issues. I made sure you were blacklisted before you could even build a reputation. And your precious fiancé, David, the one who walked out on you 3 weeks before the wedding, without a single word of explanation, I paid him $50,000 to disappear. I wired the money from Gregory's private account myself. A collective gasp swept through the gallery. Judge Aris lowered his glasses, utterly appalled by the casual admission of targeted destruction. You systematically sabotaged your own daughter's life, Judge Aris asked, his voice thick with disbelief. She left me no choice, Carolyn screamed, pounding her fist against the wooden railing. She was always too smart, too arrogant, always analyzing everything we did. She made Sydney look incompetent. She made Gregory look foolish. She was a constant glaring threat to Sydney's shine, a threat to the natural order of this family. I had to break her down. I had to make her dependent on us so she would stop trying to outgrow her proper place. I stood completely frozen. The betrayal washed over me, not in a wave of sorrow, but in a freezing, clarifying flood of absolute rage. The years of self-doubt, the endless nights, wondering what was wrong with me, the agonizing heartbreak of David leaving. It was not a flaw in my character. It was a calculated, orchestrated execution by the woman standing across the room. You are admitting to tortious interference, defamation, and malicious intent on a federal record, Mrs. Vance, Judge Aris stated coldly. Carolyn waved her hand frantically, entirely unconcerned with the legal consequences of her confession. She was entirely focused on the $80 million. She realized that character assassination was not enough to stop me from taking control of the trust. She needed a legal disqualification. She needed an absolute technicality. None of that matters now, Carolyn shouted, gripping the edges of the witness stand, her face flushed dark red with desperation. The Beatrice Vance Trust has strict, unbreakable stipulations. You all know the law. The principal capital can only be managed by and distributed to direct descendants. It is an ironclad bloodline clause. Judge Aris narrowed his eyes. Ms. Meredith is Beatrice Vance's granddaughter. She is the most qualified direct descendant available to act as conservator. Carolyn threw her head back and let out a sharp, victorious cackle that bordered on absolute hysteria. She looked at the judge, her face twisted in pure, unadulterated malice. She has no legal standing in this family trust, Carolyn screamed, her voice carrying an absolute devastating finality. She is not even a blood relative. We bought her from a junkie teenager when we needed good PR for my husband's political campaign. The echo of Carolyn's words bounced off the marble walls, hanging in the air like toxic smoke. The entire gallery inhaled a collective, sharp breath. For a full 10 seconds, nobody moved. I stood frozen behind the plaintiff's table. My hands, which had been perfectly steady while exposing millions in corporate fraud, suddenly went numb. I could feel the blood draining from my face. My mind frantically raced through 34 years of family history, the lack of baby photos, the way Carolyn always held me at arm's length, Gregory's cold transactional approval. It all clicked into a devastating, horrifying mosaic. I was a public relations stunt. I was a prop. Across the aisle, a sound cut through the suffocating silence. It was laughter. Sydney, who only minutes ago had been hyperventilating in sheer terror at the prospect of losing her stolen mansion, was throwing her head back and laughing. It was a harsh, ugly sound echoing with malicious relief. She pointed at me, her face twisting into a triumphant sneer. You hear that, Meredith? Sydney crowed, her voice shrill and carrying across the courtroom. You are nobody. You do not belong here. You have no blood in this game. You are just a stray dog they picked up off the street. You get absolutely nothing. Carolyn did not sit down. She stood at the witness stand, her chest heaving, her eyes burning with a rabid, desperate victory. She looked to her left, snapping her fingers at the remaining senior partner of her high-priced estate firm. Mr. Gable, a man who looked entirely out of his depth following Trey's violent arrest, suddenly scrambled to his feet. He recognized the legal lifeline Carolyn had just thrown him. He practically dove for his leather briefcase, ripping out a thick bound copy of the original trust documents. Your Honor, Mr. Gable shouted, his voice shaking with renewed frantic energy. I move for immediate dismissal of the plaintiff's petition for conservatorship. I direct the court's attention to Section 4, Paragraph B of the Beatrice Vance Irrevocable Trust. The language is explicit and absolute. It dictates that all trust assets, management, and conservatorship duties must remain exclusively within the biological lineage. The exact phrasing is direct blood descendants. Mr. Gable slammed the heavy document onto his table, pointing a shaking finger at me. If Carolyn Vance's testimony is accurate and this woman is not a biological member of the Vance family, she has zero legal standing in this courtroom. She is a legal stranger to Beatrice Vance. She cannot petition for conservatorship, she cannot audit the trust, and she certainly cannot freeze my client's access to the capital. We demand an immediate DNA test and, pending those results, a full dismissal of all her claims. Harrison Cole slammed his hand flat against our table, the crack of flesh on wood startling the room. Objection, Your Honor. Harrison roared, stepping directly in front of me to physically block their line of sight. This is a desperate, unsubstantiated smear tactic from a woman whose fake son was just hauled away in handcuffs. A legal adoption grants full equal rights under the law. Not when a private family trust explicitly dictates biological lineage, Mr. Gable shouted right back, his desperation peaking. This is private wealth, not public policy, Your Honor. The grantor's intent is paramount, and the grantor specified blood. She is a fraud attempting to hijack an $80 million estate she has no biological right to. Order! Judge Aris bellowed, banging his gavel, the sharp cracks cutting through the shouting match. I will have order in my courtroom. The judge ran a heavy hand over his face, looking deeply troubled. He pulled his own copy of the trust document toward him, flipping rapidly through the heavy parchment pages. The room fell into a terrifying, agonizing hush as he read the specific clause. I stared at the wood grain of the table. I felt entirely hollowed out. I had brought forensic accounting to a knife fight, completely unaware that the very foundation of my identity was a lie. If the bloodline clause held, Carolyn would win. She would unfreeze the assets, pay off the fraudulent mortgages, and bleed Beatrice dry. I would be thrown out onto the street exactly as Sydney had said. Judge Aris finally looked up. His expression was grim, his eyes apologetic but bound by the absolute letter of the law. Mr. Cole, the judge began heavily. A legal adoption is indeed binding in matters of state and federal law. However, private trusts can dictate distribution based on biological lineage if the language is explicitly restrictive. Paragraph B is remarkably restrictive. If your client is not a biological descendant and the defense files a formal contest regarding her standing, I have no choice but to grant a temporary stay and unfreeze the assets until paternity is verified. Carolyn let out a long, shuddering breath of absolute victory. She turned her head, offering me a smile of pure, venomous satisfaction. It was the smile of a woman who had just successfully buried her own child to save her bank account. Sydney clapped her hands together, a vicious, delighted sound that grated against my ears. Judge Aris raised his gavel to make the ruling official. But the gavel never fell. At the back of the courtroom, the massive, heavy oak doors did not just open. They were shoved apart with such violent, commanding force that the brass handles slammed against the marble walls like a gunshot. Every single head in the courtroom snapped backward. The bailiffs at the door instantly stepped aside, their posture rigid with shock. Footsteps echoed against the floor. They were not the slow, shuffling steps of an elderly woman deep in cognitive decline. They were sharp, rhythmic, and terrifyingly precise. The sharp click of expensive heels on polished stone. Beatrice Vance walked down the center aisle. She was not in a wheelchair. She was not hooked up to oxygen. She was not wearing the faded, humiliating hospital gowns Carolyn had forced her into for the past 3 years. She was wearing a tailored, immaculate black Chanel suit. Her silver hair was perfectly coiffed, pulled back to reveal the sharp, aristocratic angles of her face. She held no cane. Her posture was ramrod straight, projecting an aura of absolute terrifying power. But it was her eyes that made the entire room freeze. They were not cloudy or confused. They were burning with a lucid, unholy fury. She walked directly past Carolyn, not even granting her daughter-in-law a single glance, and stopped squarely in front of the judge's bench. Judge Aris stared at the woman before him, his gavel frozen mid-air. The entire courtroom held its breath, trapped in a suffocating vacuum of absolute silence. Beatrice Vance did not wait for an invitation. She walked directly past her daughter-in-law, stepped up to the witness stand, unlatched the wooden gate, and seated herself with the poised, immaculate grace of a queen reclaiming her throne. Mrs. Vance, Judge Aris finally managed, his voice thick with astonishment. "We were informed by your family and by signed medical affidavits that you were entirely incapacitated." Beatrice adjusted the cuffs of her jacket. She looked at Carolyn, whose face had drained of all color, resembling a wax figure rapidly melting under intense, unforgiving heat. Then Beatrice turned her piercing crystalline gaze back to the bench. "I am not senile, Your Honor." Beatrice stated, her voice ringing out with terrifying bell-like clarity. "I am simply surrounded by parasites." Carolyn let out a strangled gasp, gripping the wooden rail of the defense table, as if her legs could no longer support her. Sydney clamped a hand over her mouth, her eyes darting frantically toward the exits. For 3 years, Beatrice continued, never breaking eye contact with the judge. "I have sat in a wheelchair I did not need. I have swallowed vitamins they told me were heavy sedatives. I allowed my son and his wife to believe they were slowly, methodically stripping away my autonomy. I did this because I needed to see exactly how far their greed would push them. I needed to know if the family I built was worth saving." Beatrice turned her head slowly, leveling a gaze of pure, freezing disdain at Carolyn. "They failed the test," Beatrice said. Mr. Gable, Carolyn's high-priced estate lawyer, scrambled to his feet, his hands shaking so violently he dropped his pen. "Your Honor, I must object. My clients were operating under the advice of highly respected medical professionals. We have the cognitive decline reports right here." "You have reports written by physicians Carolyn paid under the table," Beatrice snapped, cutting him off with the authority of a whip crack. "Doctors who never spent more than 5 minutes in my presence. If you look at the plaintiff's table, you will see my granddaughter's attorney, Harrison Cole. He has my actual medical records. Records compiled by the chief of neurology at Massachusetts General Hospital, whom I paid privately out of pocket to examine me every single month for the last 3 years. I have the cognitive function of a woman half my age." Judge Aris looked at Harrison, who simply nodded, tapping a thick sealed folder on his desk. The judge leaned back, crossing his arms. "Proceed, Mrs. Vance." Beatrice folded her hands neatly in her lap. "Let us discuss the money. 30 days ago, at a private family dinner, I handed Gregory, Carolyn, and Trey each a cashier's check for $5 million. I told them it was an early inheritance. I told them I wanted to see them enjoy it while I was still alive. I remembered that night. I remembered the sheer outrage on their faces. They laughed at me," Beatrice said, her voice dropping into a deadly quiet register. "They thought I was having a manic episode. They thought I was writing checks from an empty account. Carolyn actually tore her check into pieces right in front of my face. They demanded full, immediate control of the entire $80 million principal. They filed this exact petition for conservatorship the very next morning." Beatrice looked at Mr. Gable, who was now sweating profusely through his expensive suit. "Those checks were not a manic episode," Counselor Beatrice stated smoothly. "They were a legally binding settlement offer drafted by my private corporate counsel, and attached to that offer was a highly specific, irrevocable no-contest clause." The color vanished entirely from Mr. Gable's face. He collapsed back into his chair, the legal reality of what she had just said hitting him like a freight train. "By physically destroying those checks and formally petitioning this court to seize the entirety of my estate against my will," Beatrice explained, her voice echoing off the marble walls, "my son and his wife triggered their own execution. The in terrorem clause was activated the second they filed that paperwork. By attempting to take everything, they legally, completely, and permanently disinherited themselves. They get nothing." Sydney let out a sharp, hysterical sob, burying her face in her hands. Carolyn looked like she had stopped breathing entirely. The $80 million life raft they desperately needed to save them from federal prison and bankruptcy had just been vaporized. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Gregory Vance staggered inside. He looked completely destroyed. His custom Italian suit was rumpled and stained, his tie was missing, and his face was the color of wet ash. He had clearly just come from his seized mansion, having lost the final battle with his creditors. He heard Beatrice's declaration. He saw his mother sitting upright on the witness stand. Gregory marched down the center aisle, ignoring the bailiffs who stepped forward to intercept him. He pointed a shaking, desperate finger directly at me. "It does not matter," Gregory yelled, his voice cracking with sheer, unhinged desperation. "It does not matter what we triggered. The trust is bound by blood. Carolyn just put it on the federal record. Meredith is not blood. She has absolutely zero legal standing to inherit anything." Judge Aris banged his gavel, but Beatrice held up a single white-gloved hand. The judge stopped. The courtroom fell dead silent. Beatrice did not flinch. She watched her son with a look of absolute, profound disappointment. Slowly, she reached into the interior pocket of her Chanel jacket. She withdrew a single folded piece of heavy yellowed parchment paper. "You are absolutely correct about one thing," Gregory, Beatrice said, her words striking the room like physical blows. "She is not your blood." Beatrice unfolded the document, smoothing it out against the wooden railing of the witness stand. 30 years ago, you and your wife decided this brilliant, beautiful child was a public relations liability," Beatrice said, her voice dripping with venom. "You threatened to send her back to the foster system because she did not fit the perfect, polished image of your upcoming political campaign. You thought I would simply stand by and watch you discard a human being like a piece of defective merchandise." Beatrice held the yellowed document up high. The official gold seal of the family court caught the light. "I did not just stop you," Beatrice declared, her voice rising with terrifying, triumphant power. "I bypassed your guardianship entirely. I went to a private judge. I secretly, legally adopted Meredith as my own daughter." Carolyn let out a blood-curdling scream. Gregory fell to his knees in the center aisle. "She is not your child, Gregory," Beatrice stated, looking down at her ruined son. "She is my daughter, and she is the sole absolute heir to the Vance estate." The courtroom vibrated with the aftershock of Beatrice's declaration. Gregory remained planted on his knees in the center aisle, his mouth opening and closing without a single sound emerging. Carolyn's blood-curdling scream had dissolved into a ragged, breathless wheeze. She clawed at her own throat, her perfectly manicured nails leaving angry red scratches against her collarbone. The $80 million safety net had not just been pulled away. It had been completely incinerated. I stood completely still, staring at the woman I had called grandmother for my entire life. The woman who had quietly, ruthlessly outmaneuvered her own son to save me from the foster system. The profound weight of her protection anchored me to the floor. Judge Aris reached over his elevated bench, his hand trembling slightly as he accepted the yellowed parchment from Beatrice. He adjusted his spectacles, examining the document with forensic intensity. He traced the embossed gold seal of the family court, the verified judicial signatures, and the irrefutable filing dates. He looked from the document to Gregory, then to Carolyn, and finally to me. The heavy silence in the room stretched until the tension felt thick enough to shatter stone. Judge Aris picked up his heavy wooden gavel. "The defense's motion to dismiss based on the biological lineage clause is entirely overruled," he announced, his voice booming with absolute, terrifying authority. "This document is a legally binding adoption decree executed under seal 30 years ago. Meredith is the legal daughter of Beatrice Vance. Therefore, she possesses full, unassailable standing as a direct descendant under the explicit terms of the trust." He turned his piercing gaze toward the defense table. The elite estate lawyers were already zipping their leather briefcases shut, practically sprinting toward the wooden swinging doors to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of their clients. Furthermore, Judge Aris continued, raising his gavel high. "Based on the irrefutable financial evidence presented by the plaintiff and the deplorable self-incriminating testimony provided by Carolyn Vance herself, I am dismissing the petition for conservatorship filed by Gregory Vance with prejudice. You are hereby stripped of all power of attorney, all access to the Vance estate, and all legal standing regarding Beatrice Vance. The trust remains under the sole exclusive control of Beatrice and her legally designated heir, Meredith. You get absolutely nothing. He slammed the gavel down. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot, sealing their absolute ruin. A sudden commotion erupted at the back of the room. The heavy oak double doors were propped wide open, revealing the marble vestibule hallway outside. The two local bailiffs were in the middle of processing Trey for his violent outburst, writing out a citation on a wooden bench. Hearing the judge's final ruling boom through the open doors, the last shred of Trey's polished facade vanished. He knew the truth. With the trust completely out of reach, his fraudulent venture capital fund would default by morning. Trey violently shoved one of the distracted bailiffs backward, sending the officer crashing into a trash receptacle. Trey made a desperate, frantic dash toward the emergency exit stairwell. He did not make it 3 steps. 4 large men stepped out of the shadow of the corridor, completely blocking his path. They were not local police. They wore dark, heavy windbreakers with bold yellow lettering plastered across their backs. FBI and IRS. Trey slammed into the lead agent, bouncing off the man's solid chest. He scrambled backward, his eyes darting wildly around the hallway like a trapped rat. Marcus Thorne, also known as Trey Vance, the lead federal agent, stated, his voice devoid of any emotion. You are under arrest for multi-million-dollar corporate embezzlement, federal wire fraud, and interstate identity theft. Trey looked through the open doorway, his chest heaving, his face slick with terrified sweat. He locked eyes with me. I walked slowly down the center aisle, my heels clicking softly against the marble, until I stood just a few feet away from the doorway. You think I only prepared a slide presentation for the judge? I asked, my voice cold and carrying clearly across the quiet courtroom. You think I uncovered your offshore Cayman server and your fraudulent margin calls just to win a civil dispute? I triggered a comprehensive federal audit of VCAP Holdings 3 weeks ago. I sent every single server ping log, every wire transfer receipt, and every forged signature directly to the federal authorities. They were simply waiting for you to verify your fraudulent identity on the federal court record today. The federal agents did not give him a chance to speak. They grabbed his arms, spinning him around with brutal efficiency and slamming him face first against the marble wall of the vestibule. The heavy, unmistakable sound of federal steel cuffs ratcheting shut over his wrists echoed into the courtroom. Sydney watched the entire scene unfold from the defense table. Her eyes tracked the federal agents as they read Trey his Miranda rights, effectively locking away her entire future. The reality of her total, absolute ruin crashed down upon her. The mansion would be seized by the IRS. Her bank accounts would be frozen by federal mandate. She was pregnant, completely broke, and married to a fugitive. She let out a piercing, guttural wail. She scrambled out from behind the defense table, tripping over her own expensive designer heels. She collapsed onto the polished floor, crawling and dragging herself across the center aisle until she reached me. She fell to her knees, right at my feet. She reached up with trembling, manicured hands, grabbing handfuls of my inexpensive beige skirt, her hot tears soaking instantly into the fabric. She was no longer the arrogant golden child who had mocked my existence and laughed at my supposed lack of bloodline. She was a broken, terrified shell facing complete annihilation. "Meredith, please," Sydney screamed, her voice cracking as she sobbed hysterically, her grip on my clothes tightening like a vice. "You have the 80 million. You have the trust. Please, he is my husband. We are sisters. You have to pay his bail." Sydney's fingers dug into the fabric of my skirt with the frantic, bone-crushing grip of a drowning woman. Her perfectly styled hair clung to her wet, blotchy face. The golden child of the Vance family, the woman who had spent 3 decades treating my existence as a hilarious, pathetic joke, was now weeping at my shoes. She begged for the very money she had just gleefully declared I had absolutely no biological right to touch. I looked down at her. I did not feel a shred of pity. I felt nothing but the cold, absolute clarity of a balanced ledger. I reached down, my hands perfectly steady. I clamped my fingers around Sydney's wrists. I did not yank or pull violently. I simply applied a firm mechanical pressure, peeling her manicured fingers off my skirt one by one. I stepped backwards, smoothing out the wrinkles in the cheap beige fabric. Like Mom said, we do not share blood, I stated, my voice echoing with terrifying clinical precision through the cavernous courtroom. And I only invest in good assets. Sydney let out a hollow, devastated gasp. She collapsed forward, her forehead pressing against the cold marble floor as her sobs turned into jagged, hyperventilating wheezes. Behind her, the heavy oak doors slammed shut. Trey Vance, the Ivy League fraud. The Cayman's embezzler. The man who was supposed to be the architect of their ultimate wealth was gone. I turned my attention back to the plaintiff's table. Gregory and Carolyn were frozen in the center aisle. The aristocratic arrogance that had defined their entire existence was entirely eradicated. I watched the terrifying reality of federal mathematics rapidly calculating behind Gregory's panicked eyes. The offshore Cayman server was seized. The fraudulent venture capital fund was frozen by the Securities and Exchange Commission. Gregory's personal retirement portfolio of $12.4 million was locked inside a federal evidence vault inextricably linked to a fugitive's money laundering operation. The sprawling Beacon Hill mansion, leveraged to the absolute limit with forged institutional loans, would be seized by the banks before the end of the business day. They had absolutely nothing. A lone federal agent in a dark windbreaker stepped back through the courtroom doors. He held a thick stack of manila folders. He did not look at the judge. He walked directly up to Gregory. "Mr. Vance," the agent said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion, "the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation will be contacting you and your wife within the hour. We have secured your signatures on the collateral mortgage documents underwriting VCAP Holdings. You are officially designated as material accessories to federal wire fraud. I strongly suggest you do not attempt to leave the state of Massachusetts." The agent turned and walked out. Gregory swayed on his feet. The color completely drained from his face, leaving his skin the color of wet ash. Accessory to federal wire fraud carried a mandatory minimum sentence. He was not just bankrupt, he was going to federal prison. Gregory snapped. The primal, terrifying instinct for self-preservation kicked in. He spun around and lunged toward the witness stand, throwing his entire body weight against the heavy wooden railing. "Mother, please!" Gregory shrieked, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. He looked up at Beatrice, his eyes wide and completely feral with terror. "You have to help us. They are going to take the house. They are going to seize everything we own. I am your son. I am your only son. You cannot let me die in a federal penitentiary for co-signing a loan." Carolyn realized that her pride was an absolute luxury she could no longer afford. She scrambled across the floor, abandoning her weeping daughter. She threw herself against the railing right next to her husband, her flawless facade entirely destroyed. "Beatrice, please listen to reason," Carolyn begged, her voice shrill and echoing wildly off the vaulted ceiling. "Think of Sydney. Think of the baby. We need capital to retain criminal defense counsel. Just a fraction of the trust, just enough to pay the bail and keep us out of federal custody. We will do whatever you want. We will sign whatever you need." I watched them grovel. These were the people who had hired actors to frame me. The people who had systematically destroyed my career, paid off my fiancé to abandon me, and tried to lock this brilliant elderly woman in a psychiatric ward just to steal her wealth. Now, stripped of their power, and facing the brutal, unforgiving machinery of the federal government, they were begging for a handout. Beatrice did not flinch. She did not offer a single ounce of maternal sympathy. She stood up from the witness chair. She smoothed the front of her immaculate Chanel suit, adjusting her cuffs with slow, deliberate, aristocratic grace. She looked down at her son and her daughter-in-law with an expression of profound, absolute disgust. "I gave you $5 million on Christmas," Beatrice said, her voice dropping into a deadly quiet register that cut through their frantic pleading like a scalpel. Gregory and Carolyn froze. The memory of that night hung heavily in the air. The night they had laughed in her face. The night Carolyn had arrogantly torn the cashier's check into confetti, demanding the entire $80 million. "You threw it in the fire," Beatrice stated, her icy crystalline eyes locking directly onto Gregory's terrified face. "Enjoy the ashes." Beatrice stepped down from the witness stand. She did not look at them again. She walked directly over to me. She extended her arm. I took it, linking my arm through hers. We turned our backs on the defense table. We walked together down the center aisle, our footsteps ringing out in perfect synchronization against the polished marble. Behind us, the absolute destruction of the Vance family finally ignited. Gregory spun around, his face twisting with rage as he began screaming at Carolyn for bringing Trey into their home. Carolyn shrieked right back, blaming Gregory for his reckless financial greed. Sydney wailed from the floor, screaming at both of them for ruining her life. The sound of their vicious, chaotic implosion echoed loudly through the courtroom. We did not stop. We did not turn around. We pushed open the heavy oak doors, stepping out of the shadows of the courthouse and directly into the blinding, brilliant sunlight. The transition from the heavy, suffocating oak doors of the courthouse into the blinding afternoon sunlight was not merely a change in scenery. It was a complete, irreversible realignment of my universe. The toxic gravity the Vance family had exerted over my entire life was permanently severed. 6 months evaporated since the swift crack of Judge Eris's gavel, and the crisp autumn air of Boston now blew freely through the open windows of my corner office. I sat at the head of a massive polished mahogany table, reviewing the quarterly disbursement schedules. The $80 million Vance Trust, once a weapon used to control and manipulate, no longer existed in its original form. In its place stood the Harrington Beatrice Philanthropic Fund, and I was its sole chief executive officer. Beatrice had handed me the reins with absolute, unwavering confidence. She preferred to spend her days tending to her prized greenhouse orchids and advising me over afternoon tea, completely detached from the frantic social climbing she had always despised. We were currently funding 3 new pediatric research wings across the eastern seaboard and establishing comprehensive full-ride scholarships for aged-out foster youth. Every single dollar that Gregory and Carolyn had desperately tried to steal was now being deployed to build the kind of futures they would have arrogantly scoffed at. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been entirely rewritten, bound by ironclad legal structures that shielded our assets from any future interference. While my world expanded into a realm of genuine purpose, the walls surrounding my former tormentors had violently claustrophobically contracted. The federal justice system possessed zero appreciation for Ivy League pedigrees, country club memberships, or manufactured social standing. Marcus Thorne, the man who had successfully masqueraded as Trey Vance, was currently residing in the Federal Correctional Institution at Danbury. He had pleaded guilty to multiple felony charges to avoid a drawn-out, highly publicized trial, securing a non-negotiable 15-year sentence. There were no tailored Italian suits, vintage Rolex watches, or imported sports cars in his reality anymore. His daily existence was reduced to a sterile concrete cell, a scratchy jumpsuit, and the crushing, inescapable monotony of scheduled head counts. The fraudulent empire he had built entirely on charm and stolen collateral had vanished into thin air, leaving him with absolutely nothing but time to reflect on his arrogance. Gregory and Carolyn experienced a different but equally brutal kind of prison. The Internal Revenue Service had been ruthlessly efficient in their asset recovery. Their Beacon Hill mansion, their luxury vehicles, their antique furniture, and their offshore retirement accounts were systematically seized to pay off the massive liabilities Trey had engineered under their forged signatures. They avoided federal prison time by turning state's evidence against their son-in-law, but their financial and social execution was absolute. They now lived in a cramped 200-square-foot studio apartment on the grimy industrial outskirts of the city. Carolyn, a woman who used to spend her afternoons berating Michelin-star chefs and terrorizing retail workers, now wore a stained, ill-fitting polyester uniform. She worked the cash register at a local discount grocery store, forced to smile at the very working-class people she had spent her life mocking. Gregory spent his days sweeping concrete floors and stacking heavy inventory at a hardware warehouse. They returned every single night to a roach-infested room, their aristocratic pride replaced by the bone-deep, humiliating exhaustion of minimum-wage survival. Sydney's descent was perhaps the most poetic justice of all. Stripped of her golden child status, cut off from her parents' bank accounts, and abandoned by her fraudulent husband, she was forced to face the stark reality of her own empty existence. The designer lifestyle she had aggressively flaunted to make me feel inferior was built entirely on credit and lies. Yesterday, my private investigator sent me a final photograph to officially close out her file. The image showed Sydney standing in the dingy, neon-lit lobby of a downtown pawnshop. She was heavily pregnant, her previously flawless blonde hair unwashed and tied back in a messy frayed knot. She was arguing fiercely with the pawnbroker across the scratched glass counter, desperately trying to sell a stack of Chanel and Hermes handbags to make rent. The broker was pointing a UV authentication light at the stitching, shaking his head in firm refusal. Trey had not even bothered to buy her real designer goods. He had funded her insufferable arrogance with cheap counterfeits, leaving her with absolutely nothing of actual value to sell. I closed the investigative file, sliding it smoothly into the industrial shredder beside my desk. The past was officially liquidated. I grabbed my tailored wool coat and walked down the bustling street toward the towering glass and steel headquarters of First National Bank. Mr. Jenkins, the senior wealth manager, stood up immediately the moment I entered his plush, soundproof office. He gestured respectfully toward one of the supple leather guest chairs. I sat down, crossing my legs with practiced grace, and accepted the demi-tasse of rich espresso his assistant quietly placed on the desk. We spent the next hour finalizing the last of the quarterly wealth transfers, formally securing the funding for a massive new women's shelter project downtown. When the final page of paperwork was signed and notarized, I reached into the interior compartment of my leather briefcase. I withdrew a small, elegant silver frame and placed it precisely in the center of his immaculate glass desk. Inside the frame, pressed perfectly flat against the black velvet backing, was a single jaggedly torn half of a cashier's check originally made out for $5 million. Mr. Jenkins adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, looking down at the torn, useless piece of paper, and then up at me, a silent, respectful question in his eyes. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my espresso, letting the rich, dark flavor settle before meeting his gaze. "They thought they were tearing up my worth, Mr. Jenkins," I said, setting the porcelain cup down on its saucer with a soft, final clink. "But all they did was hand me the keys to the kingdom, fade to black." The profound lesson learned from these stories is that true family is defined by genuine support and integrity, not merely by bloodlines. Repeatedly, we see how toxic entitlement, greed, and blind favoritism can cause relatives to betray those closest to them. However, these devastating experiences also highlight the incredible power of resilience. Walking away from emotional abuse and financial exploitation allows individuals to build their own success and forge a chosen family that respects their true worth. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic environment to protect your peace? And what did it teach you? Share your experiences in the comments below.